Casting of lots. During the first few days after the moon had blown up, Doob had spent hours gazing up at Potato Head, Mr. Spinney, Acorn, Peach Pit, Scoop, Big Boy, and Kidney Bean. They were visible in the daytime, just as the moon had formerly been, and even on the rare day when it was cloudy in Pasadena, or he was stuck indoors, he could pull up a window on the screen of his computer and watch them on a live video feed. After he had figured out that they were going to kill everyone on Earth, he had become a lot less interested in staring at them. He had, in fact, sometimes gone for weeks without looking up at the gradually spreading cloud of debris. Sometimes, while walking across a dark parking lot or driving down the highway, he would catch sight of the moon chunks in the sky and deliberately turn his gaze away from them. They filled him with horror, and even a kind of shame over the fact that he had once found the whole thing such a fascinating science treat. He did not want to be reminded of it. Instead, he tracked the slow disintegration of the moon pieces through spreadsheets and plots shared with him by his graduate students and his colleagues. He did everything he could to reduce the whole state of affairs to two numbers. One of these was the bolide fragmentation rate, or BFR, which was a measure of how frequently big rocks were being made into small rocks. The other was, quite simply, how many days remained before the white sky. On day 7, minutes after they had met, he and Amelia had watched Kidney Bean fracture into two big chunks, later dubbed KB1 and KB2, though attempts had been made at the time to give them cutesy names of their own. 3 weeks later, Scoop had collided with Big Boy and broken into 3 pieces, SC1, SC2, and SC3. Big Boy itself was now BB1, still fairly recognizable, plus a whole family tree of bits that had shrapnelled off its smaller piece, BB2. These were given code numbers such as BB2-1-3, meaning the third biggest fragment of the largest fragment of the second biggest piece of Big Boy. Beyond about that level, it became difficult and somewhat pointless to keep track of them all. Mr. Spinney had caused all sorts of havoc before finally breaking in half. Its wayward children, MS1 and MS2, had gone winging off in opposite directions and ended up in big eccentric orbits around the rubble cloud's shared center of mass, occasionally looping in from a great distance and slamming into one of the slower-moving pieces. MS2 had broken Acorn into 3 pieces just 3 days before Doob's memorable Oval Office chat with the president. While he'd been flying back to LA, a hunk of it, the size of an oil tanker, had slammed into the Indian Ocean and kicked up a tsunami that had killed 40,000 people on the west coast of India. After he got home from his trip to D.C., he and Amelia checked into a suite at the Langham, a palatial hotel in Pasadena, so that they could spend a few days together before he went on a round-the-world journey. All through their romantic dinner on the terrace, he made a concerted effort not to look at the remains of the moon. Later they went back to their suite and made love. After 20 minutes post-coital cuddling, Amelia rolled over on her side and went to sleep, inviting Doob to spoon with her. But Doob, unable to relax, pulled his tablet onto his lap, put on his reading glasses, and started killing time on the internet. The French doors to the balcony were open, and at some point the breeze coming in through them obliged Amelia to snuggle deeper under the blankets. Doob got up and walked over to close the doors and was confronted by the sight of the moon cloud directly in front of him, hanging over the lights of LA and now something like 4 times the diameter of the original moon. It was arresting, partly because it had been so long since he had looked squarely at it. And so he stood there, for a while, observing. Peach Pit was still largely in one piece, but other than that, the original 7 sisters were no longer discernible. Out of curiosity, he consulted an app that told him when Izzy would be passing over, and saw that it was going to happen in about 10 minutes. So he stood there and waited for it. As he waited, his attention turned again and again to the pieces of the moon. What was their future? He knew that they would shatter into an uncountable number of fragments and become the white sky and then the hard rain. But what was the final distribution of sizes going to be? How many big ones and how many small? They had some models based on the simplifying assumption that all moon rock was basically the same, but clearly that wasn't true. They had done some analysis on the original chunks, trying to figure out why Peach Pit was so resistant to fragmentation, and determined that it was simply the inner core of the old moon, which was confirmed anyway by an analysis of its mass. Peach Pit was much denser than the other bits, suggesting that it consisted mostly of iron as opposed to rock. The moon had had an iron core, but relative to overall size, this was much smaller than the Earth's. Most of the moon was cold, dead stone. And yet the core was there, and was thought to consist of a ball of solid iron surrounded by a somewhat hotter jacket of molten iron mixed with various other elements. All of this had been stripped bare and exposed to space by the agent. For the first few hours, Peach Pit had literally glowed with radiant heat. Or so they guessed, since the dust kicked up by the cataclysm had cloaked it for a while. Some of the core's outer jacket of molten metal must have been torn away, dispersed into the rubble cloud as goblets and slugs and droplets of melt that soon cooled and hardened. As much was proved by metal-rich bolides that had since plowed into the earth and been dug up and analyzed. By the time the dust had literally settled to the point where Peach Pit and its siblings were clearly observable, an outer crust had formed over it, consisting of melt that had cooled swiftly as it radiated its heat into space. The cooling had continued ever since. Now, the better part of a year later, Peach Pit, or PP1 as it was now designated, was still warmer than the other parts of the moon. It had shown greater resistance to fragmentation. Other rocks bounced off it or dashed themselves to pieces on its gleaming surface. A few significant chunks, PP2, PP3, and so on, had been ripped off in the early days when it had still been soft, but now it was clad in a mile-thick armor of solidified iron that was proof against just about any calamity, short of a second agent. Dube became so absorbed in such thoughts that he almost missed the transit of Izzy across the sky. It angled directly over the rubble cloud, seeming to weave among the giant, tumbling boulders, though this was, of course, an illusion. It had long been the brightest man-made object in the sky, and it was brighter now that so many pieces had been added onto it. The effort had been impressive, stirring even, but seeing it against the scale of the disaster behind it forced him to ask himself what was the point? What was the longer-term plan for the cloud arc? The swarm concept was a nice architecture, much more survivable than one big ship. But where was it going to go? No one seemed to be talking about that. He understood why. Survival was the first imperative. Long-term strategy came next. The amount of iron in PP1 was, for all practical purposes, infinite. It would take humans many thousands of years to find uses for that much metal. But it was way up high, hard to reach, and yet they had to reach it. And it was closer, easier to reach than the Arjuna asteroids that Sean Probst was so excited about. Feeling an idea take shape in his head, like an iron core congealing deep in a moon, he put it on hold and forced himself to turn his attention to more immediate questions. A few days ago in the Oval Office, he had formed a resolve to get his ass into space and begin making things happen up there, which was fine, but he had 3 months left on terra firma. he couldn't neglect his responsibilities here, some of which, the most important, were to his kids, to Amelia, and to their frozen embryo. But on top of that, he had been given other jobs, and if he screwed them up badly enough, e.g., because he was standing on hotel balconies in the middle of the night thinking about how much iron was in PP1, then they might not send him up to the Cloud Ark at all. He hadn't wanted to go, but once he had assented to the idea, he had begun wanting it more than anything, and he now feared that they would take it away from him. And if they sensed that fear, they could use it to control him. Better to overperform, to exceed expectations, to act like it was nothing at all. 72 hours later, he was looking out the window of a U.S. Navy helicopter, banking through a misty Himalayan valley as it lined up its final approach to a runway in Bhutan. Or perhaps the runway in Bhutan was the more correct phrasing. There are about 750,000 people in this country, which meant that they were entitled to supply 2 candidates for the Cloud Ark. The arithmetic was a little fuzzy. If the same ratio were applied consistently all over the world, something like 20,000 candidates would be gathered in. If an arklet could accommodate 5 people, then 4,000 arklets would be needed in the swarm. Each arklet required a heavy-lift rocket to get it into orbit, and some assembly and prep work once it had reached Izzy. Could it be done? If the entire industrial capacity of the world were thrown into the production of rockets, arklets, spacesuits, and the other goods needed? Perhaps, but probably not. Doob was privy to some recent estimates that put the numbers at closer to 1/4 of that figure. And anyway, could the arklets really support 5 humans each? Without a doubt, they were large enough for 5 humans to bang around in, but it was not at all clear that each could be self-sufficient in food production. Building a sustainable ecosystem in a tube the size of a railway tank car was no small task. Biosphere 2, a well-known experiment in the Arizona desert, had attempted to support 8 people on an ecosystem the size of a couple of football fields, and been unable to make it work long-term. But its mission had been clouded by political strife and odd quasi-spiritual factors. A more down-to-earth project, run by the Soviets, had determined that 8 square meters of algae, an expanse of pond scum about the size of 2 ping-pong tables, was needed to keep a single human supplied with oxygen. In the space between the hard inner hull and the inflated outer hull of a single arklet, there was more than enough room. But much more real estate would be needed if the arklet were also to produce food. And those calculations didn't even begin to address the real complications of keeping thousands of people alive in space for many years. It wasn't enough just not to asphyxiate and not to starve. People would need medicine, micronutrients, recreation, stimulation. Ecosystems would get out of whack and need to be repaired with pesticides, antibiotics, and other hard-to-make chemicals. The thrusters that kept the arklets out of trouble would need to be refueled, and not only that, but they would need maintenance and repair. The idea of a completely decentralized Cloud Ark was a chimera. It was not sustainable without a mothership, a central supply dump, and a repair depot. The only plausible candidate for that was Izzy, but Izzy wasn't designed for anything like that purpose. They'd been trying to make it over by cramming it with vitamins, but that only delayed the moment when they'd run out of all the goods they didn't know how to produce in space, and people would begin dying in quantity. From the fact that he had gotten nowhere raising awkward questions about this, Doob inferred that the architects knew about it, and were on it, and just didn't want to talk about it because public doubt and controversy were not going to help. Doob's job, clearly, was to act like everything was okay. Today, that meant scooping up 2 young people from the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. Did the little performance he was about to put on really mean that 20,000 people from all over the world were going to end up living happily in the Cloud Ark? He just had to shut down the little Rain Man in his head, Doob as in dubious, and not even think about it. They had taken off 2 hours ago from the George H.W. Bush, a supercarrier keeping station in the Bay of Bengal. Doob had viewed the ship through the eyes of a man who, in a few months, would be making a permanent move to its orbiting equivalent. She was a completely artificial island, thousands of people densely packed into a wad of pure technology. The professionalism of the crew and the efficiency with which she ran were amazing. Could something like that be duplicated in space, with people chosen by lot from all over the world and trained in camps over the course of a single year? He reckoned he would know more in about half an hour. The Navy chopper plunged into a fog-stuffed slot between mountains and knifed through steam and mist for a few minutes. The airport's sole runway came into view, startlingly close to them. The chopper flared to a perfect landing a stone's throw from the terminal building. Doob became aware that his jaw was clenched and tried to relax it. He had made the mistake of Googling this place and learned that it was bracketed by 18,000-foot mountain peaks, that only 8 pilots in the world were certified to land here, and that even they didn't attempt it unless the sun was shining on the runway. Obviously, the kinds of guys who flew choppers for the Navy operated according to different rules, but it had still been a white-knuckle approach as far as Doob was concerned, and it made him wonder how he was going to react to being hurled into space on top of a hastily constructed tube full of explosive chemicals. He shifted in his seat and felt a thick manila envelope slide out of his lap and to the deck with a solid thunk that almost woke up Tavistock Prowse. Tav had been sitting across from him for the entire duration of the flight and had been sleeping for the last half hour, prostrate from jet lag. He was a bulky man, not especially tall, but constructed like a wrestler. The bald spot on the back of his head, which had been faintly visible even when he'd been in college, had expanded mercilessly, leaving just a monk-like fringe of close-cropped hair around the back of his bullet-shaped head. Perhaps to draw attention away from it, he wore glasses with massive black frames. At one point a serious weightlifter, he had softened and spread in the last decade, and even more so since Zero. It was strange in a way to see him unconscious, for he never seemed to stop moving. Doob had a pretty good idea why. Tav was hoping he'd get picked. If he worked hard enough, popped up on enough news feeds, garnered enough followers on Twitter, maybe some important person would decide that the Cloud Ark needed a professional communicator, the first or the last journalist. To Doob, it seemed like long odds. A lot of people with PhDs and even Nobel Prizes were ahead of Tav in line, but you never knew, and he couldn't fault the guy for trying. He bent forward and retrieved the envelope from the deck. It was a centimeter thick. It was labeled Paro Bhutan in neat block letters. The flap had never been opened. He was supposed to have spent the last couple of hours reading its contents, familiarizing himself with the task to be performed, instead of which he had been looking out the window at the steamy green plains and lazily braided rivers of Bangladesh. Hoping to make the most of the 2 or 3 minutes it would take to get the chopper's door open, he plucked it up off the floor, tore it open, and pulled out a sheaf of pages. This was enough to wake Tav up, but not enough to make him move. He gazed at Doob and watched him read. "If it's wearing red, yellow, or both, it's a llama," he said. "Bow to it." "Isn't that a camel from South America?" "With 1 L. A holy man. Put the palms of your hands together and make a little bow." "I don't believe in... It's not going to kill you, is it? If he's got a big yellow scarf over his left shoulder, he's the king. Bow lower in that case." "Thanks. Anything else?" Sitting next to Doob was Mario, their photographer, a man in his 30s with a short, dark mustache, a New York accent, and no expectation whatsoever of being picked for the Cloud Ark. On the flight over, he had divided his time between reading his own copy of the same dossier and playing a video game on his phone. He had been on many more of these than Doob or Tav. Getting into the spirit of things, he pocketed his phone and piped up,
"People are gonna hand you things. Some of them might be really crusty and old and funny smelling. Those things are probably really important. Really important. Then why are they? Because they believe that you are going to take it all up into space and preserve it." Oh. So, if anyone hands you anything, even if you have no idea what on God's green earth it might be, look impressed, bow, take it carefully, admire it, and then hand it off to the helper kid. Helper kid. People have been deputized to follow you around and help you carry all of the priceless national treasures that are going to be bestowed on you. They'll look after the stuff and bring it all back here to the chopper so you can keep your hands free from making those little bows and shaking hands with the king or whatever. As soon as we get back to the aircraft carrier, we'll throw it overboard. Done this before, have you? This is my 73rd abduction run. Let's go.
Mario stood up, carefully, letting his cameras and bags swing free, patting each one as it settled into place. Tav and Doob were undoing their seatbelts and watching him for cues. Mario took 2 steps toward the door, which the pilot had just swung open. Cold, damp air, scented with pine and coal smoke, was pouring in. Doob almost rear-ended Mario as he stopped suddenly and turned around to look him in the eye.
"One other thing." "Yes?"
Doob said.
"What is about to happen is going to be incredibly fucking sad. Like, maybe the saddest thing you have ever seen. Try to hold it together."
Mario held Doob's gaze until Doob nodded and said,
"Thanks."
Then he turned around and bolted for the door so that he could get some good pictures of Dr. Harris emerging from the chopper. Dr. Harris paused in the open hatchway. Spread out in front of him were at least 24 people in red and yellow clothing, drawn up in readiness to extend greetings. He put his palms together in front of his chest and bowed. In front of him, Mario's shutter began to whir. Behind him, faint digitized clicks spilled out of Tav's phone as he live-tweeted it. The king drove him up the mountain in his personal Land Rover, Doob riding shotgun in the passenger seat on the left. For Bhutan, as it turned out, was a drive on the left country. Mario sat in the back, angling to get both of them in the photo, and Tav sat next to Mario, muttering voice memos into his phone. The king apologized for today's murky weather, which was blocking potentially spectacular views of high mountains all around. "But I suppose that is a very small matter in the larger scheme of things," he concluded. They stopped at an intersection in the town of Paro to let 3 boys kick a soccer ball across the road in front of them. Piled up on the road behind them was a small motorcade of llama-packed Toyotas. "So much joy they take in this simple game," the king mused. "They know, of course. All of them know about the disaster that is to come. When they are thinking of it, it makes them sad. But at other times, they are as you see them, oblivious." The boys got out of the way, and the king eased forward into the intersection. The town had a surprisingly alpine look to it, with deep brown, weather-beaten structures of wood built on stone foundations. "Until a few days ago," the king went on, "they might have consoled themselves by imagining that they would be the ones chosen." "In the casting of lots," Doob said. "Yes." The king shot him a keen look. "I was responsible for choosing, you know." He glanced back at Tav. "That is off the record." "No, Your Highness. I did not know that," Doob said. "We received guidelines, I suppose you could call them, saying that it was not a literal casting of lots. The choice is best not left to chance. We must send only the finest candidates. Bhutan has only 2 places in the Cloud Arc. It would be foolish to waste them on someone unable to represent our people. So it was a selective process." "Most people have come to the same conclusion," Doob said. "A pool of promising candidates is identified, and then the choice is made from among them by some process which might be random, just so no one person carries the entire responsibility." "When you are a king,"
You sometimes have such responsibilities whether you want them or not. In this case, though, I was able to involve some of the llamas. There are precedents for such a selection procedure in the way that certain reincarnate llamas are identified. The drawing of lots from an urn is sometimes used.
Tav couldn't resist asking from the back seat.
What does the doctrine of reincarnation have to say about the situation we are faced with now?
The king smiled.
Mr. Prowse, this is only a journey of 10 kilometers. I am taking it slow. If we had a road trip ahead of us of 10,000 kilometers, an enjoyable thought, I might be able to impart enough information to you about what reincarnation means to my people that we would be able to have an intelligent conversation about it. Fair enough. Sorry, Tav said, glancing up from the screen of his phone when his brain detected a pause in the king's speech. You have to understand, my job is to communicate with geeks, people who like math, so I was trying to imagine, when 7 billion die and only some thousands remain, where do the 7 billion souls go? Yes.
They turned off what Doob guessed was the main road and onto a fork that wound through a wooded hamlet above the river. This hooked onto a bridge that took them across a fast-running, cold-looking stream, green and milky with rock flour carried down from melting glaciers thousands of meters above their heads. Doob still couldn't get over the fact that in a little more than a year those glaciers would be gone, the rock beneath them exposed for the first time in millions of years, and no scientist would be there to record it. We don't believe in anything as simple as metempsychosis, the movement of an individual soul from one body to another. That's not what we mean by reincarnation at all.
What do you believe in, then?
Doob asked. Tav had lost interest and was belaboring his phone with his thumbs.
A better analogy might be to a burned-down stump being used to ignite a new candle. But I won't be able to give you a satisfactory answer, Dr. Harris. The teachings are esoteric, deliberately hidden from the uninitiated, specifically to prevent false interpretations. How an enlightened Lama would think about the question of the 7 billion is as far beyond my comprehension as are the quantum gravity theories that you study in your work. On this side of the river, the ground rose almost vertically. The mountain barrier was cleft by a steep-sided valley that zigzagged up and away from them. The road leaped up into it and switchbacked up a stone cliff, fringed here and there with clusters of hardy evergreens that had found toe-holds in crevices. Tendrils and torn veils of mist drifted across the face of the rock, providing occasional glimpses of a white tower, high above them, that had somehow been constructed on the precipice. It was one of those buildings, like some monasteries in Greece and Spain, whose whole point was to proclaim to those below, "This is how far we will go to achieve separation from the world." They drove up a road between long green terraces until the ground became too steep for wheels, and then the king stopped the Land Rover and set the brake. "How's your cardio?" "Could be better," Doob said, "but I don't have a heart condition or anything like that." "We are about 3,000 meters above sea level. You are welcome to await the chosen ones here in my vehicle, or—" "I could use a walk, thanks," Doob said, and glanced back at Mario, who shrugged philosophically, and at Tavistock Prowse, who appeared to be biting his tongue. As they hiked up the trail, followed at a respectful distance by an entourage of llamas, children, photographers, and officers of the Bhutanese military, the king told Doob that the place they were going was called the Tiger's Nest, and that it was one of the most sacred sites in their religion, being the spot where Guru Rinpoche, the second Buddha, had, in the 8th century, flown in from Tibet on the back of a tiger. Later, a temple complex had been built around the caves where Padma Sambhava, for apparently this was an alternate name for the same personage, had lingered to meditate. Doob pleased himself by suppressing the urge to point out to the king that tigers were not capable of flight. This was only partly because he was gasping for air.
He did not really care about the plausibility of the story, given the astonishing beauty of the place through which they were hiking. It was one thing to be fed a line of religious hokum in a desert hellhole that had nothing to recommend it as a site for tourism. But in order to go for a few hours' walk with a king in Shangri-La, he would put up with any amount of fairy tales and metaphysical ramblings. Small temples and devotional sites emerged from the mist every few minutes. They stopped part of the way up to enjoy a serving of chai in a little cafe with a fine view of the tiger's nest. Tav, at the end of his rope physically, announced he would go no farther. Doob, Mario, and the king pushed on along the increasingly precarious walkway to the gates of the monastery itself. This, the king had already informed Doob, was off limits, and in any case would have made a poor showing as a site for a ceremony, being rather cramped, dark, mazy, and ancient. Crag-dwelling hermit monks didn't go in much for grand ceremonial courtyards. Instead, there was a sort of wide spot in the ledge just before the entrance to the White Temple. Waiting there were the two arkers, a boy and a girl, both in their early 20s, clad in what Doob assumed was traditional costume. For the boy, a robe that stopped at his knees, with a large white scarf over his shoulder and crossed to his hip. For the girl, a bolt of colorfully woven cloth, wrapped around her waist and falling to her ankles as a sort of columnar skirt, with a yellow silk jacket above that, draped with many necklaces of turquoise and other colorful stones. Had she been here, Amelia, in a single glance, would have noticed 100 details about the weaving, the embroidery, the jewelry, the drape of the fabric, the choice of colors. She would have charmed the king right out of his saffron scarf. She would have climbed out of the Land Rover back in Paro and made friends with the soccer-playing boys. Amelia, not Doob, was the person who ought to be doing all of this. But Amelia wasn't going to the Cloud Ark, and Doob was. The boy and the girl, Dorji and Jigme respectively, were backed by some leathery oldsters in similar but simpler costumes, presumably their families, and several llamas. Prayer wheels were spinning, bells were chiming back inside the monastery, monks were chanting. Everyone was crying. They all bowed to their king. Doob was glad Tav had not come this far. Some kind of conversation took place in the local language. Doob didn't even know what the name of that language was. Mario, oblivious to the emotional tenor of the proceedings, darted around snapping photographs, dropping to his knees or even throwing himself flat on the ground so that he could get mountain peaks or temple roofs in the backdrop of shots. Doob, who had no idea what was going on, couldn't take his eyes off the faces of the elders, who were doing their best to hold it together in the presence of their monarch, but clearly suffering through ruinous emotional pain as they prepared to say goodbye to Dorji and Jigme forever. It was almost worse than watching your kid die, Doob thought. Then there was finality, certainty, a gravesite to visit, whereas these two were just going to hike off into the mist. A thunder of helicopter blades would announce their departure, and after that the family members would get vague assurances that Dorji and Jigme were going into space to carry forward the cultural legacy of Bhutan. Assurances that, Doob was pretty sure, were going to be fundamentally dishonest. These people were going to go to their deaths in 15 months, consoling themselves with that belief. He now understood his job a lot more clearly. Why were the doomed people of Earth not going completely berserk? Oh, there had been some outbreaks of civil disorder, but for the most part people were taking it surprisingly calmly. It was because events like this were happening in every city and province with more than a few 100,000 people, and they were being stage-managed well enough to convince people that the system was working. When he was a kid, he had read the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, which hinged on the premise that the people of Athens had somehow been persuaded to select 7 maidens and 7 boys by lot every few years and send them to Crete to serve as monster chow. This had always struck him as the weakest point of what was otherwise a great yarn. Who would do that? Who would choose their kids by lot and send them to such a fate? The people of Bhutan, that was who. And the people of Seattle, and of the Canelones district of southern Uruguay, and of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and the South Island of New Zealand, all of which Doob was scheduled to visit in the next 2 weeks to collect the maidens and the boys they had chosen by lot. They would do it if they could be made to believe it would protect them. As Mario had predicted, Doob was presented with some extremely old-looking artifacts by almost equally old-looking monks, who smiled at him through tears and backed away, bowing, once Doob had accepted their prayer wheels and sutras and carvings into his hands. The king took Dorji and Jigme by the hand, turning his back on the mourners, or the well-wishers, or whatever they were, and nodded at Doob as if to say, "Your move." Doob bowed one last time, then turned around and began leading them down the mountain. Day 306. Arklet 1, which had been sent up on day 285, turned out to have a few teething problems with its maneuvering thrusters. And so the first bolo coupling in the history of the Cloud Ark took place between Arklet 2 and Arklet 3. Those had been launched on days 296 and 300, respectively. These first 3 Arklets represented competing designs, and so they all looked a little different. No matter. They were destined to be punched out in different factories and launched on different types of heavy-lift rockets from different spaceports, so minor variations in styling were to be expected. They all had the same general shape, though, a cylinder with domed end caps. That was for the ineluctable reason that they had to be pressurized in order to perform their basic function of keeping humans alive. And pressure, sooner or later, made everything round. Dinah thought that the pressure hulls looked like the big liquid propane tanks seen next to cabins and mobile homes in the rural mining camps where she had grown up. Others likened them to railway tanker cars or stubby hot dogs. They were just big aluminum cans with domes welded onto the ends. The walls of the can had a thickness of about 1 millimeter. The domes were a bit sturdier. The thickest and strongest parts of the hull were in the places where the domes overlapped the ends of the can. The analogy was to a plastic soda bottle, whose thin wall could be crumpled in one hand when the lid was off, but which became amazingly stiff and strong when it was pressurized. Or at least, that was what NASA was saying to people who were alarmed by the idea of living 1 millimeter away from the vacuum of space. The first 3 Arklets were launched naked and smooth, but the hundreds to follow would come up clothed in translucent fabric jackets, pleated and wrinkled during the passage through the atmosphere, protected beneath fiberglass fairings. Once in space, the blanket would be inflated to form a flexible outer hull somewhat larger than the inner one. It was in that interhull space where food would be grown, making use of sunlight that would diffuse through the fabric. It was not clear yet whether each Arklet could be self-sufficient in terms of food production. Probably not. But growing some food was better than growing none. Having some green stuff on board helped reduce the load on the CO2 scrubbers, and having water between humans and space helped stop some incoming radiation. One of the end caps sported a docking port, designated in NASA Public Relations cant as the front door. It was a bit of a misnomer since it was the only door. Once sealed up inside the pressure hull, the occupants could only get out of it by docking the Arklet to something with breathable air on the other side of it. The opposite end of the Arklet was called the boiler room. Mounted outside of it was the trash can-sized nuclear generator that supplied the arklet with power. Around that were various fittings for connection of plumbing lines, electrical mains, cooling equipment, and the like, none of which would ever be used except in the case when a number of arklets decided to dock themselves together and form a semi-permanent cluster. Those sturdy, thick rings, where the domes met the main body, served as attachment points for anything of a structural nature, anything that would exert significant forces on the body of the arklet. Radiating from each of those rings were 8 stubby radial spokes, extending outward to halo-like rings where thrusters and grappling equipment were attached. Those parts were shipped inside of the arklet, then, once it was in space, extracted through the docking port by spacewalkers and bolted on in 0G. The halos also served to stiffen and stabilize the inflatable outer hull in arklets so equipped. But in the first 3 test units, they just projected out into space like bicycle rims, studded with small thruster nozzles and laced through with plumbing. Spanning the distance between the front door halo and the boiler room halo was a single, long, spindly member, hinged at the front or forward end, so that it could, on command, snap up and out, projecting sideways from the arklet for a distance of about 10 meters. Mounted to the end of this arm were a camera, a target, and an electromechanical grappling device, collectively known as the paw. A cable ran from the paw back down the length of the arm to a reel near the docking port, where 250 meters of it were wound up like thread on a spool. The arm, the paw, the rope, and the reel were all there to achieve a specific maneuver, never before attempted, denoted in official NASA engineering documents as the Bolo coupling operation, but referred to everywhere else as the high five. On day 306, after arklets 2 and 3 had been assembled and checked out, the first Bolo coupling operation was initiated. It happened several kilometers away from Izzy. It was done quietly and secretly, in case it failed, but lots of video was taken, in case it succeeded. The operation had many possible failure modes, which was engineering speak, meaning that it could go wrong in so many different ways that trying to think them all through was impossible. So, each of the 2 arklets needed to have a qualified pilot, someone who understood orbital mechanics and spaceship propulsion well enough to bring an errant craft back in hand by manual control. Few such people had ever existed, and only 4 of them were aboard Izzy. Right now, down on the ground, thousands of young people selected in the casting of lots were learning how to do it by piloting virtual arklets in video game simulations. But none of those people was ready or in orbit yet. So Ivy ended up at the controls of Arklet 2 with Dinah as passenger and general assistant. Piloting Arklet 3 was a recent arrival, Marcus Luker, a Swiss Air Force pilot turned astronaut and a veteran of 2 previous missions to the ISS. His background piloting high-performance fighter jets through alpine valleys seemed like a reasonable qualification for this job. His assistant was Wang Fu Hua, one of the first Chinese taikonauts to have reached Izzy during the pioneer days of a few months back. After a good night's sleep and a light breakfast, the 4 participants met in the banana to go over the details one last time with engineers on the ground, then ascended a spoke into the weightless environment of H1 and glided up the stack, the central axis of the space station, snaking through work bays and temporary supply dumps until they reached a docking node that, after a few twists and turns, led them into a hamster tube. One after the other they slithered down it. Dinah, in number 3 position behind Marcus, found it difficult to keep up with him. The soles of his feet kept getting farther and farther away.
"Just like scaling the Daubenhorn,"
he said at one point,
"except without the annoyance of gravity."
"Is that a mountain?" Dinah asked, since the hamster tube was long, and she felt that a bit of light conversation would help ease the lump in her stomach.
Yes, a famous Klettersteig where I grew up. You must come and give it a try one of these days.
Marcus called back. A common error in etiquette among people who had only recently arrived at Izzy was to talk about Earth as a place that it was possible to go back to, as if this were a temporary mission like all of the previous ones. Dinah said nothing. Marcus would realize his mistake if he hadn't already.
Oh well,
he added. Yes, he had realized it. What's a Klettersteig? Dinah asked, trying to move on.
It is a mountain climb that is pre-engineered with cables, ladders, and so on.
To make it easier, Dinah guessed.
Oh no, it is not easy. It is a way to take a climb that would be impossible and make it merely extremely difficult.
Okay, Dinah said. A good metaphor for what we are trying to do up here, then.
Yes, I suppose so,
Marcus said, cheerfully enough. They came to a junction of hamster tubes, and after scrutinizing the felt-tipped annotations on the walls left by past travelers, they went their separate ways. Dinah leading Ivy to the right, while Fu Hua and Marcus headed straight on. After passing 3 occupied docking ports and exchanging perfunctory greetings with the people living in the capsules on the other sides, they came to the end of the hamster tube and passed through a docking port. They floated into a tubular space 4 meters in diameter and 12 meters long, illuminated by icy bluish-white LEDs. Its wall was a smooth cylinder of aluminum, striped with barcodes and stippled with batch numbers from the mill that had produced it. A long, straight weld ran up its length. At the far end, the curve of its boiler room dome, penetrated by many plumbing and electrical connections, was visible through a flat fiberglass grate. A disk of industrial catwalk material in a bilious shade of green. A ladder made of the same material extended up from there to the front door, through which Dinah and now Ivy entered. It put Dinah immediately in mind of Marcus with his talk of Klettersteigs. You didn't need to have a ladder unless you were expecting gravity, or a reasonable facsimile of it. The grate at the far end of the arclet was going to end up serving as the floor, or as a floor, the lowermost story. The arclet was long enough to divide vertically into as many as 5 stories by inserting more of those grated discs. Cleats for that purpose were attached to the walls at regular intervals, but the grates hadn't been installed yet. Dinah pushed off against the top rung of the ladder and flew down until she could arrest her momentum against the boiler room grate, then spun herself about so that her feet were touching it and her head was pointed back up toward the front door. This brought her eyes level with several flat panel screens that had been mounted to the walls. They served as status indicators and control panels for the equipment mounted to the outside of the dome. The little nuke was the only thing that mattered to them at the moment. It had a screen all to itself. Dinah woke it up with a tap. It refreshed itself with a graphical display showing the temperature of the plutonium pellet at its core, its current output level, the RPMs, and health metrics of the Stirling engine that converted its heat into electrical power, and the charge level of the batteries and of the supercapacitor that served as a buffer to store energy when it wasn't needed and release it when it was. Everything seemed normal there. Not much could really go wrong with these things. This one was brand new. She pivoted to another display that gave her information about the array of thrusters mounted to the halo just outside. Arclets were pretty short on windows. The only place you could see out was at the forward end, where a couple of small portals had been let into the dome adjacent to the docking hardware. Just below one of them was what the engineers called a couch, and what the casual observer would be more likely to describe as an expensive lawn chair that had somehow found its way into space. Ivy had already strapped herself into it and was waking up another bank of flat panel screens there. Dinah could hear her murmuring into the microphone on her headset, which she had jacked into the assortment of plastic boxes that, in this context, passed for a control panel. She was running through a checklist with mission control and talking to Marcus, who by now must be strapped in at the controls of Arclet 3. Gazing around, Dinah saw the gleam of a camera lens, no larger than a raven's eye, set into a tiny plastic pod on the wall in the middle of the Arclet. Then, for no particular reason, she started crying. There'd been surprisingly little of this. Certain Morse code messages from Rufus were guaranteed to turn on the old waterworks. Ivy and Dinah permitted themselves to shed tears in each other's presence when no one else was around, and a few other people, such as Louisa, had joined that club more recently. But there was always something to do, some emergency to take care of, always people around watching. No privacy. This empty Arclet was the largest volume of uninterrupted, unoccupied space that Dinah had been inside since boarding the Soyuz capsule at Baikonur a year and a half ago. It seemed vast to her, and she felt alone in it, and she couldn't help herself. She knew that the camera was watching her and that she was being recorded on digital video that was being archived. Psychologists in Houston might be judging her fitness for duty at this very moment. But she didn't care. She'd stopped caring about what the people in Houston thought a long time ago. When she started crying, it developed a kind of unstoppable momentum, and she just had to let it run for a while. Her thoughts had begun to ramble away from her own family and situation and toward the Arkers who would live and die in tin cans like this one. If it didn't work, if the whole Cloud Ark idea was just a panacea, as some people suggested, then the last thoughts and impressions ever recorded by a human soul might take place in an environment exactly like this one. And maybe Dinah would be that soul. The problem with crying in Zero-G was that tears didn't run down your cheeks. They built up in jiggling sacs around your eyes, and you had to shake them off or dab them away. Dinah didn't have anything to dab with. The plastic coveralls they wore were notoriously non-absorbent. And so she just drifted in the bottom of the Arclet, looking at the light from the control screens through bags of warm salt water.
"Some assistant you are,"
Ivy called back, after letting her go on for a few minutes.
"Sorry,"
Dinah blurted out.
"That was mission critical. Try not to short out any of the equipment. Tears conduct electricity."
"I think they made it all pee-proof. Remember, these things are designed for amateurs."
"Tell me about it,"
Ivy snorted.
"The user interface is so easy to use I can't do anything."
Something light whacked into Dinah's head. Through the tears, she vaguely saw a white object caroming off the nuclear reactor's user-friendly control panel. Pawing it out of the air, her hands recognized it as a packet of tissues, a high-value black market item. She tore it open, pulled out a few sheets, and began the somewhat delicate process of soaking up the tear globs without smashing them into sprays of equipment-shorting droplets.
"I mean, my God, what would Marcus think of you?"
Ivy demanded. It took Dinah a few moments to catch up. "Him and me? You think?"
"It is so obvious."
After a thrilling first few weeks, things had kind of trailed off with Reese. It was okay. Easy come, easy go. She had never seen him as a stable long-term prospect. The times they'd been living in, and the place they'd been living, weren't really conducive to long-term pair bonding. Louisa, wearing her anthropologist hat, had watched the spontaneous, mostly short-lived couplings of Izzy's inhabitants with a combination of dry amusement, scientific fascination, and frank, hilarious envy. "I don't know," Dinah said. "I see where you're going, but he seems a little Captain Kirk."
"You need a little Captain Kirk in your—"
"In my what?"
"In your life. Reese is too introspective."
"Is that a euphemism of some kind?"
"He's depressed."
"Gosh, I wonder why."
"No, not that way. Not about the world ending and everyone dying. I mean that when he's working on a project, he's full of energy,
but when it's finished, he just kind of collapses. On the tip of Dinah's tongue was a remark about how well that observation aligned with Reese's lovemaking style, but she held back. You realize that all of this is being recorded.
Get used to it,
Ivy said, and Dinah could sense her shrug from 12 meters away.
Hang on. Gonna give the forward thrusters a little pop. Backing out of our parking space.
She wasn't kidding. The thrusters gave off something very like a bang when they went off. Dinah, who wasn't actually hanging on, felt a few moments of disorientation as the whole arklet moved backward around her while she remained motionless. The green grid dropped away from her, and the front door approached, but all so slowly that she needed only to reach out and glide a hand along the ladder to control her relative motion. In a few seconds, the forward end of the arklet reached her, and she stopped herself against one of the struts of Ivy's couch. Next to it was a knot of straps and pads like a rock-climbing harness, which Dinah now spent a couple of minutes untangling and climbing into. The bangs of the thrusters, the hisses and clicks of the associated plumbing, and Ivy's murmuring into the microphone served as accompaniment while she got herself strapped in and donned a headset of her own. That enabled her to hear the clipped military-style transmissions among Ivy, Marcus, and their controller on Izzy. An engineer in Houston weighed in every few minutes with questions and observations. Once they had drifted well clear of Izzy, they initiated a programmed burn a few seconds long that took them to a slightly higher orbit. For a while, they could see nothing but empty space through their windows. The sun must have risen over the Earth's limb, because bright round spots appeared on the wall. Ivy said, I have 3 on radar and am engaging MAP. That being the 3-letter acronym for Monitored, Autonomous, Piloting. The operation they were about to perform, the high five, was deemed way too ticklish to be handled by noob spaceship pilots. It had to be a robotic operation the whole way, but the algorithms and the sensors that told them what was happening were all brand new, so experienced pilots had to sit at the controls, watching through the window and taking over if and when the robo-pilot started acting screwy. The thrusters began to pop in a different rhythm, a patter of tiny firings very different from how a human being would operate them. The starfield swung past the windows. The splotches of sunlight veered around the walls, and suddenly, Arklet 3 rotated into view, a few hundred meters away. It, too, was flying under map, coming about until its front door was aimed their way. Dinah stifled the impulse to wave at Marcus and Fu Hua. It was unprofessional, and anyway, they wouldn't be able to see her through the tiny porthole. A spindly white arm swung outward from the side of Arklet 3 and locked into position, extended off to one side. A few moments later, they heard and felt their own arm actuating likewise, and watched an animation of it on a flat screen. Bringing up the paw camera, Dinah muttered, and tapped a control that flooded a screen with high-resolution video from a telephoto lens mounted at the end of the arm. This showed nothing at first, but the blue limb of the Earth's atmosphere down in one corner. Then, a target-like pattern veered across the screen, slowed, and veered back. All of this was accompanied by more fidgety percussion from the thrusters. The feed was remarkably close and clear. Comparing it to the direct view out of the porthole, Dinah could see the target on the end of Arklet 3's extended arm, looking tiny from this distance. But the machine vision system now in control of their little spacecraft had found it and recognized it, and, "We have a lock," Ivy said. "We see you, 3.
"We see you, 2.
Marcus answered.
"It proceeds."
It proceeded with a long firing of the aft thrusters that nudged them forward enough that Dinah could feel the pressure on her bottom, sense the straps of the harness tightening. The target flailed around some, but a few moments later the lock was reestablished. Dinah could see Arklet 3 growing larger. Numbers on a screen gauging the distance between the ships, or, to be precise, between the two ships' outstretched paws, were counting down. "It is all nominal," Ivy said, but the last word was drowned out by a digital voice making an announcement over the Arklet's rudimentary PA system. "Bolo coupling operation entering its terminal phase. Prepare for acceleration." And then, in classic NASA style, it counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Grapple initiated. At 1, the test pattern on the screen disappeared in shadow, for it was too close now for the camera to even see it. The paws of Arklet 2 and Arklet 3 slapped together like runners exchanging a high five as they passed each other going opposite ways. Strange, whiny noises propagated down the arm into the hard shell of the Arklet. "Grappling achieved," said the voice. Dinah's ears finally identified the whiny noise as the sound of cable unwinding from a spool. She felt a lurch in her stomach as the Arklet did a half-somersault, reversing its direction so that it was pointed back at its Bolo partner. As she knew, having studied this maneuver for weeks, the two Arklets were now joined together by a cable. They had flown right past each other, but the tension on that cable had spun them around so that they were pointing toward each other again. She verified this with a glance out the window, which gave her a view of the nose of Arklet 3 slowly receding as it backed away from them. The spool of cable mounted next to its docking port was in motion, unwinding as the two craft gained distance from each other. In the exact center, the cables of Arklets 2 and 3 were clasped together by a coupling device that could be remotely disengaged whenever they made the decision to go their separate ways. "Congratulations, Bolo 1, said the engineer down in Houston. "The first autonomously driven coupling of two spacecraft to create a rotating system for production of Earth-normal simulated gravity." Earth swung past beneath the other half of Bolo 1, and Dinah felt the awareness of her own throat that would culminate, 5 minutes from now, in vomiting. The two Arklets were already swinging slowly around each other, producing a small amount of simulated gravity, even less than what they experienced in the banana. But the map system wasn't satisfied with that. Once the two Arklets were far enough apart not to take damage from each other's thruster exhaust, the system initiated a longer burn that, in combination with the slow unrolling of the cables, put their inner ears through some disturbing changes. The sound of the cable reels changed as automatic brakes engaged to slow their unwinding and avoid a damaging jerk at the end. Then there was silence for a few moments, and then another thruster burn, longer and directed laterally, to speed up the Bolo's rotational velocity. "Holy shit!" was the only thing that Dinah could say for the first minute or two. They were experiencing 1G, Earth normal gravity, for the first time in over a year. Marcus, who'd only been in orbit for a few days, sounded great. To judge from what they were hearing in their headsets, he had unstrapped from his pilot's couch and was clambering all over Arklet 3 as if it were the Dalbenhorn. Ivy and Dinah couldn't move for several minutes, and Dinah seriously entertained the possibility that she was dying. "Can you pass out while you're lying down?" she finally asked. "Remain in your positions," a voice from Houston was saying dimly, distantly, as if shouting at them through a bullhorn from 400 kilometers below. "It is a long fall to the bottom of that Arklet." A long fall. Dinah had ceased to even think in terms of up and down. The concept of falling had become meaningless to her. When you were in orbit, you were always falling, but you never hit anything. She risked turning her head to look at the grate below, and that was the trigger that forced her to reach for her barf bag. Day 333. Doob had known for a while that he was not the easiest guy to be related to. During his last 10 weeks on Earth, however, he sometimes feared he was pushing his family's patience beyond human limits with his lust for camping. Until then, his idea of a satisfying outdoor experience had been to saunter out onto the terrace of a European hotel to smoke cigars and drink brandy. His duties as an astronomer sometimes called him to remote locations, such as the summit of Mauna Kea, where he would dutifully go outside, freeze his ass off for a few minutes, remark on the awesomeness of the view and the clarity of the air, and then go back inside to sit behind a workstation and stare at images on a screen. Camping and the outdoor life in general simply hadn't been a part of the culture of his family, which tended to look with favor on being under a sound roof, in a heated space, behind locked doors, with plenty of food baking and frying in a modern, fully appointed kitchen. He had always admired his colleagues in the life and earth sciences who could hit the road on short notice with a fully stocked backpack and live rugged, adventuresome lives in exotic locales. But he had admired them from a distance. His sojourn to Moses Lake with Henry had turned him into a late convert to the outdoor life, and left him with a considerable stock of state-of-the-art gear that he was strangely eager to use. The visit to Bhutan had also been a trigger. This had been preceded by a lengthy series of flights across the Pacific and a brief stay on an aircraft carrier, cramped, crowded, artificial environments, not unlike where he would be spending the remainder of his days. Then, just for a blessed few hours, he had climbed out of that chopper into the high, cold, piney air of Bhutan and gone for a ramble in the King's Land Rover and hiked up a misty mountain that had struck him as being straight from a 1970s album cover. And he had done some introspection about the fact that he couldn't even take such a lovely place at face value, but only liken it to such pop culture references. A few hours later, he had been back on the aircraft carrier with Dorji and Jigme and about 100 other Arkers, who had been collected in a similar manner from Myanmar, Bangladesh, Nepal, various provinces of India, Sri Lanka, and scattered island groups. He had been struck by the contrast between how centered, how natural, how autochthonous the Bhutanese youths had looked when he had first seen them on the side of the cliff in their home country, and how lost they appeared in the painted steel companionway of an aircraft carrier, mixed up with other South Asians in equally colorful garb, all equally alienated from their native soil, all looking for a place to stow their priceless cultural artifacts. He had come home with the idea in his head that he needed to get a little bit of native soil on himself before getting shot up to a place where he would be every bit as lost and alienated as Dorji and Jigme had been aboard USS George H.W. Bush, which seemed uncontroversial to him. But when he presented the plan to Tav over a cup of naval coffee in one of the aircraft carrier's eateries, Tav demurred. "You are totally over-romanticizing dirt." Tav liked to play the devil's advocate. He and Doob had had many such conversations. Doob shrugged and said,
"Let's say you're right. What's the worst that could happen if I get some dirt on me while I still have access to dirt?"
"Tetanus?"
Before they started sending me to places like this, they made sure I was up to date on my shots.
"No, seriously, I just don't buy it, Doob."
"By what? What is it you think I'm trying to sell you?"
"You're trying to sell me the idea that there is such a thing as a state of nature that humans were designed to live in. It is the dirt is good hypothesis."
"But obviously we evolved in rustic outdoor settings. Those places are, in a sense, natural to us."
"But we did evolve, Doob. We're not animals. We evolved into organisms that could make things like this." Tav waved his free hand around at the painted steel environs of the aircraft carrier. "And this." He raised his coffee cup and clinked it against Dub's.
Which is a good thing, you're saying.
Compared to being torn apart by hyenas? Yeah, obviously it's a good thing.
Well, I'm not going to get torn apart by hyenas. I'm just going to go camping.
Tav smiled in a way that seemed a little forced. You don't get what I'm saying, do you? He said, Look, you know my views on the singularity, on uploading.
I did blurb your book on the topic.
Yes, thank you for that. Tav was referring to the idea that the human brain could, in principle, be digitized and uploaded into a computer, that this would one day happen on a large scale, that it might actually have happened already, that we might all, in fact, be living in a giant digital simulation. Something occurred to Dub.
Is that why you were grilling the king about his views on reincarnation?
That's part of it, Tav admitted. Look, all I'm saying is that if you've gone where I've already gone in terms of thinking about that—
If you've drunk the singularity Kool-Aid, in other words,
Dub said. Yeah, Dub, as you know I've already done. Then you've already made a fundamental break with trying to be Nature Boy. I am never going to be Nature Boy. I believe that the human mind is almost infinitely malleable and that people are going to adjust within days or weeks to life on the Cloud Ark. We will simply turn into a different civilization altogether from the one we grew up in. Our whole idea of nature will be forgotten. And 1,000 years from now, people will go on camping trips that will consist of sleeping in arklets, drinking Tang, and peeing into tubes just like their ancestors did.
To them,
Dub said,
that'll be a back-to-nature experience.
I think that's how we will see it, yes, Tav said. Dub considered uttering the punchline to the famous joke, Who's we, white man? But he thought better of it. For the next few weeks, his duties had taken him to various other parts of the world, making what Mario the photographer referred to as abduction runs, and conveying the victims to Arker training camps, where they would spend the rest of their time on Earth playing elaborate video games about orbital mechanics. Tavistock Prowse showed up for some of these. When he wasn't doing that, he was making social media posts about the themes he had articulated in his conversation on the aircraft carrier. And when Dub clicked through to those posts, he was always impressed by the number of people who were reading them. Tav was developing a following and a reputation as an important thinker about the sociology of the upcoming space-based civilization. Whenever Dub got a few days downtime, he would swoop down on a part of the country where one of his kids was living and grab them and take them camping. Henry had taken up residence at Moses Lake permanently, or as permanently as anything could be in this world. That was his youngest. Hadley, the girl in the middle, was in Berkeley. She'd been doing volunteer work for an organization in Oakland and had a lot of free time. Dub would drag her away on day hikes to Mount Tam or longer sojourns in the Sierras. Hesper, his oldest, lived outside of D.C. with her boyfriend, a military man stationed at the Pentagon. The last camping trip happened in early October. Dub still had a few weeks left, but he knew he would spend most of it in training or talking about training on TV. In the weeks to come, he might be able to play hooky and go out on the occasional afternoon hike. But the fact of the matter was that the next time he bedded down in a sleeping bag, it would be in zero gravity, in the cozy environs of a windowless aluminum can. Perhaps sensing that, Amelia had flown out on the spur of the moment. Normally, she'd have been teaching school at this point in the year, but the schedule had become fluid. It was difficult to sustain the illusion that education was of value for kids who would not live long enough to use it. They'd never take the standardized tests that they were prepping for. In a way, Amelia had said, this had led to a kind of renaissance in pedagogy. Free from the constraints of racking up high test scores or getting into colleges, students could learn for learning's sake, which was how it ought to be. The tic-tac curriculum had dissolved and been replaced by activities improvised from day to day by teachers and parents. Hiking in the mountains, doing art projects about the cloud arc, talking with psychologists about death, reading favorite books. In one sense, Amelia and her colleagues had never been more needed, never had such an opportunity to show their quality. At the same time, the routine had loosened up enough for Amelia to take a couple of days off, hop a plane to D.C., surprise Dube, and drive up into the mountains with him and Hesper and Enrique to enjoy the fall foliage. Dube had never made a real connection to Enrique, a half-black, half-Puerto Rican, all-American Army sergeant from the Bronx. But now, sitting on the tailgate of a rented SUV, snuggled under a blanket with Amelia, looking out over a rolling mountain vista gorgeous with fall color, and waiting for some sausages to heat up on the hibachi, Dube felt as close to the guy as he could to anyone. Enrique seemed to sense the thawing in his mood.
"What are you going to build up there?"
he asked. It said something about how much Dube had changed in the last year that he didn't let out a derisive snort. His face did not even change, or so he told himself. He looked over at Amelia, sitting next to him, for confirmation. She'd been trying to help Dube out. For the kids, she explained. It doesn't matter what you think, Dubois, or what you feel. It's not about you. It's not even about science. Right now, it's about telling the kids in my classroom what it is that they have to hope for. So shut up and get it done. These things were important. It wasn't just a matter of hiding what you really felt. If you hid your feelings well enough, it actually changed you. A few months ago, Dube would have betrayed cynicism, possibly long enough for Enrique to notice it. And a few months before that, he might have launched into a detailed explanation of why he was cynical, making it clear that the cloud arc was going to be an experiment in hastily improvised survival against nearly impossible odds. None of that happened. He looked at the faces of Enrique and of Hesper, lit on one side by blue twilight and on the other by the glow of the coals, and he answered the question. He answered it as if he were standing in front of a television camera streaming live to the internet.
"The resources up there are basically infinite. That was true even before the moon blew up. Now it has been busted open like a piñata. All it needs is to be shaped into the right architecture, enclosed habitations that we can fill with air and fertilize with the genetic heritage of the earth. That's going to take a while, and we'll go through some tough times first. It's going to be tough emotionally when the hard rain hits, and we have to say goodbye to all that was. And it's going to be tough afterward, when the Archers have to learn how to work together and make hard choices. By far, the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. But we'll survive. We'll use what's up there to build incubators for our heritage to live in, to grow, and to improve on what we brought with us. And eventually, the day will come when we return. The hard rain won't last forever. Oh, it'll last for many lifetimes, as long as human civilization has existed until now. And what it is going to leave behind will be a hot and rocky wasteland. But by that point, many generations will have devoted all of their hopes and their creative genius to the problem of remaking the world as well as, or better than, what we see here. We will come back. And that's the real answer, Enrique. Will we survive? Yeah. It'll be touch and go, but we will survive. Will we build space habitats? Absolutely. Small ones at first, big ones later. But that's not the real goal. The real goal will take thousands of years. The real goal is to build Earth again, and build it better.
It was the first time he'd said it this way, but it wasn't the last. In the next few weeks, his last weeks on Earth, he'd say it again to television cameras, to the president, to a stadium full of archers in training. All he knew at the time was that Enrique was nodding in a way that said, "It's going to be okay. Dube's got this." And Hesper was snuggling her head against Enrique's powerful shoulder, eyes gleaming, staring into the future that her father was conjuring with those words. Behind her, a meteor knifed across the twilight sky and exploded out over the Atlantic. Cloud Arc, Day 365.
Today we're going to talk about what it really means to have a swarm of arklets in orbit,
said famous astronomer and science pundit Doc Dubois. He was hovering in the center of Arklet 2, currently docked to Izzy. He was wearing a pressure suit with its helmet detached and slung under his arm. He was talking into one of the Arklet's built-in high-def video cameras, trusting that some computer somewhere was recording the footage.
"Cut,"
he said. Then he felt a little sheepish. He was producing and editing his own videos now, so he had just said "cut" to himself. In space, there were no video crews, photographers, production assistants, or makeup artists to follow you around. He rather liked it that way. But there was something to be said for having at least one other human in the room who could react to what you were saying. He needed Amelia there, silently shaking her head or nodding. Instead of which, he tried to imagine that he was talking to the kids in her classroom in South Pasadena on a sunny Tuesday morning. He replayed his own dialogue in their ears.
"What it really means,"
sounded skeptical, as if everything said on the topic heretofore had been a bunch of BS. And in orbit wasn't really necessary. Everyone knew that they were in orbit.
"Today we're going to talk about what it means to have a swarm of arklets,"
he said.
"In normal space, like on Earth, we use 3 numbers to tell where something is. Left, right, forward, back, up, down. The X, Y, and Z axes from your high school geometry class. Turns out that this doesn't work so well in orbit. Up here we need 6 numbers to fully specify what orbit an object, such as an arklet, happens to be in. 3 for position, but another 3 for velocity. If you've got 2 objects that share the same 6 numbers, they're in the same place. Right now, my 6 numbers are the same as those of this arklet that I'm floating in, and so we're moving through space together. But if one or more of my numbers changed, you'd see me drifting."
Dube had brought with him a small can of compressed air, a common convenience used by electronics technicians to blow dust away from things they were working on. He aimed it down toward the aft end of the arklet and pressed the button. Air hissed out, and he began drifting up toward the front door. He raised a hand above his head in time to kill his upward motion against the forward bulkhead, then turned to look into a different camera. Good. It was the 3rd time he'd attempted this, and he was running out of canned air.
"I can't drift far, confined as I am to the pressure hull. But you can imagine that if I hadn't been able to stop, if I'd been out on a spacewalk, I might have drifted a long way. And what the science of orbital mechanics tells us is that no 2 objects in orbit can have the same 6 numbers, except in the special case I just showed you, where I was inside the hollow arklet so that both of our centers of gravity could coincide. An arklet, or any other object, that is off the port side of Izzy, or to starboard, or to the zenith, or nadir side of it, or forward or aft of it, has different numbers by definition. It's in a different orbit, and so it is going to drift."
He mentally reviewed his notes. Here he had intended to be more specific about the nature of that drift. If it's in a higher orbit, it'll fall behind. If it's in a lower orbit, it'll race ahead. If it's off to one side or the other, it'll converge, then diverge on a 93-minute cycle. Only if it's directly forward or directly aft will it maintain the same relative position. But he thought maybe he could link that out to a different video, one with more graphics. Better to get to the point.
The moral of the story? In space, there is no such thing as formation flying. Physics will cause two nearby objects to drift closer together or farther away. If you want to preserve a formation, such as a swarm, you have only two options. Physically connect the arclets together so that they become one object, or else use the thrusters to correct for the drift.
There was another option, which was to put them in single file like a train in space, but it didn't seem very swarm-like, and so he left it out of the reckoning for now. Minutes after the video was posted, outraged YouTube commentators would be all over him, pointing out the error and attributing it to dishonesty, incompetence, and/or a conspiracy. His last task was to record a voiceover that would be played over footage of young archers training in huge industrial video arcades, thrown together for just that purpose in places like Houston and Baikonur.
It's not difficult to learn this stuff. Any video gamer can pick it up in a few minutes. Just ask these young archers, brought together from all over the world, who've been honing their arclet piloting skills using precision simulators. Most of the time, of course, the arclets will be flying themselves on autopilot. But if and when it's necessary for a human to take the controls, these young people will be ready for it.
The task complete, he established a link between his tablet and the wireless network of this arclet, and spent a few minutes moving video files around so that he could edit them later. Catching sight of himself in freeze-framed thumbnails, he was struck by the roundness of his face, a typical symptom of zero-G as the body retrained itself in how to distribute fluids through its tissues. Up here, it was the mark of the newbie. Doob had been in space for 6 days. This was A+1.0, 1 year to the day since he had stood in the Athenium and watched the moon disintegrate. Arclet 2, now outmoded by newer models, was docked at the far end of a hamster tube on the port side of the big truss. Sooner or later, it would probably be used for overflow storage or sleeping quarters. Doob passed through its docking port and began making his way down the hamster tube. As he'd learned on his way here, this was going to take a while. The tube was barely large enough to accommodate a svelte human in a polyester coverall. A large man in a pressure suit banged and scraped the whole way, and yet it was easier to do it with the suit on than to drag the empty suit behind you or push it ahead of you, like a zero-G murderer trying to dispose of a body. In a few minutes, he was able to reach a node right along Izzy's central axis, where he had more space to move around, and there he began taking the suit off. This was not a full-fledged spacesuit, which, with its huge backpack life support system, would have been much too bulky for the hamster tube. It was just a helmeted coverall of the type worn by high-altitude pilots. It had a leak, and so was useful only as a costume. Escaping from it developed into a sort of wrestling match, with a lot of cursing and drifting around, banging into walls. At an opportune moment, he felt a sharp tug on the rear collar of the suit. This pulled it down to the point where he could shrug out of it and get his arms free.
"Thanks,"
he said, and then looked over his shoulder to see a familiar face gazing at him quizzically. "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?"
"Moira?"
Doob said. He grabbed a handle on the wall so that he could spin himself around and get a better look. His glasses had gone askew during the wrestling match, so he poked them back up on his nose. It was her, all right, suffering from a clear case of moonface. He had last seen Dr. Moira Crewe at the Crater Lake announcement, where she had been assisting her mentor, Clarence Crouch, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist. the poor sod who had been given the job of explaining the casting of lots to the world. Since then, Clarence had died of cancer in his Cambridge home, surrounded by biological samples and scientific memorabilia that would not long survive the onset of the hard rain. No doubt it had been a blessing for him. Doob had lost track of Moira after that, but of all the people on Earth, she was one of the most obvious candidates for inclusion on the Cloud Ark. She was of West Indian ancestry, wearing her hair in finger-length dreadlocks that had adapted pretty well to zero gravity. Better than white people hair, for sure. Moonface had added a few years to her apparent age, but Doob knew her to be in her late 20s. Raised in a dodgy part of London, she'd gone to a posh school on scholarship and went on to earn a biology degree at Oxford. She'd gone to Harvard for her PhD, working with a project there on de-extinction. Her general charisma, and an accent that Americans found charming, had made her into the most well-known spokesperson for that project. She had done TED Talks and other public appearances describing her lab's efforts to bring the woolly mammoth back to life. After a brief sojourn in Siberia, working with a Russian oil billionaire who wanted to create a nature preserve stocked with formerly extinct megafauna, she had returned to the UK and begun postdoctoral work with Clarence. It was not the first time Doob had been pleasantly surprised to bump into a colleague who had, unbeknownst to him, been sent up to Izzy. It always raised an awkward point of etiquette. It was tempting to express delight and give the person a big hug, as you'd naturally do if you encountered them at a party in Cambridge or on the street in New York City. But none of them had come up here on a happy errand. And Moira, anyway, had a certain owlish way about her, a way of keeping her distance. And hugging people in zero-G was harder than it sounded. You had to get to them first. Doob held his arms out to his sides.
Hug,
he said. She did the same. Is that what one does here? She asked.
It is not unheard of. Moira, PCA, it is good to see you up here.
PCA was an abbreviation for Present Circumstances Aside, and had become a staple of Facebook, Twitter, and the like. I had heard you'd come up, Moira said, but it didn't quite register, as I've been awfully preoccupied.
I can only imagine,
Doob said.
While I've been running around shilling for the Cloud Ark, you've probably been doing actual science, huh?
Getting ready to do it might be more precise, she said. Her big brown eyes, behind a geeky but stylish pair of glasses, strayed in a direction. Is that what they call forward? She asked.
Yes.
Well, the place where I'm working is about as far forward as it's possible to get, because they want my lab to be sheltered by the big rock.
Amalthea.
Yes. And if we go there, I can show you a bit of what I've been up to. I feel I should offer you tea as well, but I don't know how to make it here. Doob smiled at her way of talking. She had been a fiend for theatre at Oxford and might have become an actress. Intensely conscious of the difference between the way her people in London talked and the way people talked at her school and at Oxford, she'd become good at switching between those accents for effect.
I'd be happy to have a look,
he said.
I think I know the module you're talking about. I saw it docking a few days ago and was curious.
He hooked the unoccupied pressure suit to the wall of Moira's lab, and it hung there, an inanimate observer, as Moira showed him around. Never one for the life sciences, Doob couldn't understand everything she was saying to him, but he didn't care. Being able to relax and let someone else explain science to him was a welcome turnabout. Do you know about the black-footed ferret? She asked.
No,
Doob said.
I think you can pretty much assume that my answer to all questions about biology and genetics is going to be in the negative.
90% of their diet was prairie dogs. Farmers killed almost all of the prairie dogs, and so the population of black-footed ferrets crashed to the point where only 7 remained. From that breeding stock, it was necessary to bring them back.
Wow, Only 7. So inbreeding must have been an issue.
We speak of heterozygosity, she said, which just means the amount of genetic diversity within a species. In general, it's a good thing. If you have too little of it, then you start to see the sorts of problems that we associate with inbreeding.
But if the breeding stock is reduced to only 7, then that's all you have to work with, right?
Not quite. Well, technically, yes, I suppose. But by manipulating some of the genes, we can create heterozygosity artificially, as well as getting rid of some of the genetic defects that would otherwise propagate through the whole population.
Anyway,
Doob said,
it's obviously of interest to us now.
If the cloud arcs as populous as they claim it's going to be, and if people come up with frozen sperm samples and ova and embryos and all of that, then the human population is probably all right. We'll have enough heterozygosity to make a go of it. My work here is going to be more concerned with non-human populations.
Meaning?
Well, you've probably heard that we'll be growing algae as a way to generate oxygen, which is only the start of a simple ecosystem that will have to be developed and grown and become much less simple over the years to come. Many of the plants and microorganisms that will make up that ecosystem will be cultivated from initially small breeding populations. We don't want to have a repeat of the Irish potato famine, or something analogous, with the plants we rely on to make it possible to breathe.
So your job will be to do with them what was done in the case of black-footed ferrets.
Part of my job, yes.
What's the other part?
Being a sort of Victorian museum curator. Did you ever visit Clarence's home in Cambridge?
No, I'm sorry to say. But I heard his collection was magnificent.
It was crammed with all of these stuffed birds and boxed beetles and mounted heads of beasts, gathered by Victorian gentlemen collector types in pith helmets, doing their bit for science on the fringes of the empire. Not scientists as we define them today, but contributors to the scientific ideal. These things overflowed the museums, and Clarence acquired them by the lorry load, especially after Edwina died and couldn't forbid it. Anyway, I'm that person now, except that the samples are all digital, and they are all on these things. She tapped a thumb drive that was floating around her neck on a chain, or their rad-hard equivalents. She pronounced the technical term with a dubious and ironic tone of voice, suggesting that she and the International Space Station would take a while getting used to each other. You know the general story. I've heard you talking about it on YouTube. She switched into a credible imitation of Doob's flat Midwestern vowels. We can't send blue whales and sequoias up on the cloud arc, and even if we couldn't keep them alive there. But we can send their DNA, encoded as strings of 1s and 0s.
You're going to put me out of a job,
Doob said. Good. Then I'll put you to work here. Moira said. This is labour-intensive as hell. And they're not sending me enough help.
I thought it was all automatic.
If the agent had given us another couple of decades to improve our gene synthesis technology, it might have become so, Moira said. As it is, we've been caught in a bit of a gawky adolescent phase. Yes, we can take one of these files. She tapped the thumb drive around her neck, and we can create a strand of DNA from it, beginning with a few simple precursor chemicals. But the amount of human intervention is still ridiculous.
I'm guessing that is some pretty high-level human intervention, too.
My Jamaican grandfather worked in the engine room of a Navy ship, Moira said, which is how our family ended up in England. When I was a little girl, he took me on a tour of one of those ships, and we went down into the engine room, and I saw it. The engine, with all of the bits exposed. The bloody thing was naked, and men had to go crawling around on it with oil cans, lubricating the bearings by hand and so on. That's a bit like where we are now, with synthesizing whole genomes.
But for now,
Doob said.
That's far in the future, right?
Yes, thank God.
For now, you're going to be tinkering with intact organisms.
Yes, just so. Still quite difficult, but I think manageable. She looked around. The module in which they floated looked nothing like a lab. Everything was sealed up in plastic or aluminum cases, taped shut and labeled with yellow sticky notes. Sorry, she said. Underwhelming. Hardly worth the trip, is it?
How can I help?
Get me some fucking gravity, Moira said. Then she laughed. Can you imagine trying to do tricks with liquids in zero-G? Because that's all a lab is.
It must look frustrating to you now,
Doob said.
Everything in boxes. No gravity to make it all work.
I know, she said. I'm whinging. They'll put this thing on a bolo, won't they?
Maybe a third Taurus. Big enough to make something close to Earth normal gravity. Lots of space to work in. A staff of eager archers.
That's your job now, isn't it? Moira said. Cheerleader for the Ark.
It was my ticket up here,
Doob said. He could feel a little warmth creeping into his face and cautioned himself not to say anything he was going to regret.
We all needed that ticket. Now that we have paid the price of admission, we need to make it work.
Moira, perhaps sensing she'd gone a little too far, kept her silence and would not meet his gaze.
And as of today, he said, we have 1 year.
Part 2. Day 700. On day 700, also known as A plus 1.335, 1 year and 335 days since the destruction of the moon, the cloud arc, as seen from the Earth, looked like a bright bead strung on a silver chain. For the reasons that Dr. Dubois Jerome Xavier Harris had tried to articulate during his soliloquy aboard Arklet 2, back on A plus 1.0, it was expensive, in terms of propellant, to maintain an actual cloud or swarm of arklets around Izzy. Much cheaper and more reliable was to have them precede or follow the space station along the same orbital path, like a queue of ducklings with Mom in the middle. Once an arklet had found its place in that train, changing its position was a maneuver whose complications were a perennial source of surprise and consternation to newly arrived members of the so-called general population. Arkies as such, people who had been selected in the casting of lots, who had spent up to 2 years in training for this mission, and who had been sent up here specifically to manage and live in arklets, understood it implicitly. As of day 700, there were 1,276 of those, with about 24 more coming up each day during the final surge of launches. New arrivals were assigned to empty arklets that awaited them at the head or the tail of the queue. These were launched on separate heavy-lift rockets about 4 times a day. Since an arklet consisted mostly of empty space, it weighed almost nothing compared to the lift capacity of a big rocket, and so they were always crammed from boiler room to front door with vitamins. These had to be extracted and stowed before the arklet could be occupied. Each arklet had its own unique manifest of stuff. Some of these were just full of compressed gas, such as nitrogen, which would later be used to fertilize crops. Others might be packed with enough diverse and seemingly random goods to open a space bazaar. Medicines, cultural artifacts, micronutrients, tools, integrated circuits, spare parts for Stirling engines, Arky's personal effects, and, in one notable case, a stowaway who was found dead on arrival. With the exception of the stowaway, who was stashed in the morgue with the rest of the deceased, all of these items had to be extracted, catalogued, and stowed appropriately. Each arklet had some onboard storage space, so to some extent, the storage was distributed, that being a fundamental tenet of the whole swarm-based architecture. Bulk materials like gases could be pumped into external tanks or bladders, little ones dangling from arklets, big ones distributed around Izzy's periphery where they could serve as extra shielding against radiation and micrometeoroids. So-called dry goods were likewise stashed in mesh bags that lived outside until such time as they were needed. Scarce and crowded inside space was reserved for organisms and goods that actually needed air and warmth. So, compared to the way it had looked a year ago, Izzy was spare and clean on the inside. Anyone who had not been chosen in the casting of lots and trained as an Archie was categorized as general population. There were 172 of those. The number grew only slowly, since most of the people who were qualified, and who were needed, ought to have been sent up a long time ago. Adding new members was attended by much political controversy down on the Earth. The Crater Lake Accord had ratified the general scheme of a cloud arc populated by those chosen in the casting of lots. It had been obvious and uncontroversial that experienced specialists were also needed, and so no one had quibbled over sending up the scouts and the pioneers. The concept of the general population had been written into the Crater Lake Accord precisely to allow for that. People like Rhys Aitken, Louisa Soder, Dubois Harris, Moira Crew, and Marcus Luker had been sent up under the GPOP clause because they knew how to do things. For every one of them who got sent up, however, 100 with similar qualifications were stranded on the ground, where some of them called their congressmen, chancellors, presidents, or dictators. The politics had become so involved as to throttle the incoming flow to a trickle. The remaining available GPOP slots were being hoarded by national governments. They were being filled grudgingly and with Byzantine premeditation. For Archies and members of the GPOP alike, it was easy to underestimate the distance separating Izzy from an arklet that was only a few kilometers ahead of or behind it in orbit. The difficulties entailed in moving from one arklet to another could be mitigated by physically docking arklets to a common structure, forcing them to fly in a rigid formation, or so it might seem to people who had not been steeped in the laws of orbital mechanics. But the fact was that an arklet docked to the end of a truss far off to the port or the starboard wing of Izzy was not in a proper orbit at all. Left to its own devices, free, that is, of the constraints imposed and the forces exerted by the truss, it would converge on Izzy, cross through Izzy's orbit, diverge from it, turn around, and converge again on the same 93-minute cycle that clocked Izzy's orbits around the Earth. An arklet mounted above Izzy, on the zenith, would want to go slower and lag behind. One mounted below, on the nadir, would want to race ahead. To the extent that the truss structure prevented those things from happening, to the extent, in other words, that it succeeded in its basic function of holding all the modules and arklets in a fixed configuration, it was undergoing stress, exerting forces on those arklets to prevent them from doing what they wanted to do. Humans in those arklets would notice themselves drifting and bumping into the walls as their natural trajectories, as ordained by Sir Isaac Newton, were perturbed by the structure of Izzy. The larger Izzy grew, and the more arklets and modules were connected to her, the greater those forces became, and the closer she came to breaking. There was another, even more compelling reason for limiting Izzy's sprawl. She was taking shelter behind Amalthea. The space station's original orbit had been carefully chosen. Any lower, and the thicker air would make the orbit decay too fast. Any higher, and the danger from micrometeoroids would increase. That was because the rocks zipping around in space were subject to the same slow orbital decay as Izzy herself, which was a good thing since it dragged them down into the atmosphere and destroyed them, leaving clear space for Izzy to sail through. Her orbital altitude of 400 kilometers was a Goldilocks compromise between too much orbital decay for Izzy and enough orbital decay to sweep the sky of dangerous rocks. The attachment of Amalthea to Izzy's forward end a few years ago had changed all of that for the better. Orbital decay was less of a problem because of the rock's high ballistic coefficient, and micrometeoroids tended to get stopped by the massive nickel-iron cowcatcher. The white sky, however, was going to put many more rocks into their path. Big ones could be detected from a distance and avoided, but little ones could do a lot of damage, and so the most important parts of Izzy needed to take shelter in the lee of Amalthea, crowding up against her aft surface. Some rocks might still come in from unexpected directions, but in general there would be a prevailing wind in the drift of lunar debris. Amalthea was aimed into it. But Amalthea couldn't protect any parts of Izzy that projected beyond its silhouette. Dinah and the rest of the Arjuna expedition's crew had made some progress in embiggening the asteroid, carving out slabs of metal and then elevating them like flaps on an airplane wing to extend the sheltered envelope, but it could only get so big. At some point, it had been necessary to draw a line under the expansion and fix the envelope, meaning that Izzy took on a definite shape and size. This had occurred on A+1.233. Since then, they had found ways to jam more modules inside that envelope, or, where that wasn't possible, to pack bags and bladders of stored material into gaps. And they had tacked on additional storage in the unprotected volume outside of that envelope. But nothing had been added to her before or since. She couldn't grow in the aft direction because Amalthea's protective shadow only extended back so far. Bolides could wrap around in any direction, since they weren't in perfectly parallel trajectories. Anyway, boost engines were needed back there, and being in the path of rocket exhaust made standing in hellfire seem like a pleasant summer's day by comparison. Amalthea was now enveloped in scaffolding, anchored directly into the nickel iron by connection points welded on or drilled in by Dinah's robots. A proboscis extended forward from that cloud of trusswork and supported a little cluster of radar and communication antennas. Forward of that, the closest arklets, 7 of them docked to a hexagonal framework, kept station about a kilometer away, far enough that the firings of their thrusters would not blast those antennas with jets of hot gas. Other heptads, as the 7 arklet clusters were called, were spaced ahead of that one at the same interval. Beyond a certain point, these petered out and were replaced by triads, 3 arklets on a triangular frame, and beyond that were singletons. A similar tapering could be observed aft of Izzy, though the distance to the first heptad was greater, respecting the danger posed by Izzy's boost engines. These heptads and triads were a bit like Lego or Tinkertoy parts, making it possible to cluster arklets together without much ado. Hamster tubes were laced through their trusses so that, once an arklet was docked, persons and material could be easily moved to other arklets on the same frame. Adapters were also floating around that would facilitate nose-to-nose coupling, but these had been found to be not as useful as the HEP and tri frames. Farther out, towards the ends of the train, it was not uncommon to see bolos. Each of these spun with its center of gravity, the grapple joining the 2 cables, tracking along the shared orbital path of Izzy and the other arklets. For now, though, almost all such coupling was for training purposes. Only about 3 weeks remained before the white sky. The Archies could survive that long in zero gravity. Formation of bolos and simulation of Earth-normal gravity was a practice intended for the long haul, when people might live their entire lives in arklets and would need gravity to build and preserve their bones, their eyesight, and other body parts that went bad in its absence. The cloud arc passed through a complete day-night cycle every 93 minutes. Time was arbitrary in space, and so the ISS had long ago settled on Greenwich time, also known as UTC, as a reasonable compromise between Houston and Baikonur. The cloud arc had inherited that system, and day 700 began at midnight at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, or A+1.335.0 in arc time. About 1/3 of the population woke up to begin a 16-hour shift. Others would wake up at A+1.335.8, or dot 8 and at dot 16. The system ensured that about 2/3 of the population was awake at any given time. Awake people needed more oxygen and generated more heat than sleeping people, so it put less of a strain on life support systems and enabled the cloud arc to support more people, if the waking and sleeping cycles were staggered. A reason for the popularity of triads was that each of the 3-component arklets could operate on a different shift, observing its own artificially imposed period of darkness and quiet. In a heptad, the same basic scheme could be used, with 2 of the arklets asleep at any given time, and the one in the middle of the hexagonal frame being always on. Doob had requested and been granted a position in the 3rd shift, meaning that he was basically operating in the same time zone as Amelia, Henry, and Hadley on the west coast of the United States. He had awakened at dot 16 of the day before, or 4 in the afternoon in London, which was 8 in the morning in Pasadena. So, at the stroke of A plus 1.335.0, when the first shift of that day began, he had been awake for 8 hours and was feeling like a brief nap might do him good. But he knew that this would only make it more difficult to get to sleep at dot 8, and so decided, as usual, to gut it out. Finding that his brain was too addled to make any sense of the latest figures from Caltech on the continued exponential breakup of moon debris, he went to the gym, which was a module containing several treadmills. To prevent their users from bouncing off them in zero gravity, these were equipped with waist belts and bungee cords that held the occupants down, pressing their feet against the belt of the treadmill and forcing the legs to do some real work. Supposedly, it was good for the bones and muscles. Amelia kept sending Doob emails asking him whether he'd exercised today, and he liked to make her happy by answering yes. A few minutes after he began his exercise routine, he was joined by Louisa Soter, who had just awakened, as she was on the 1st shift. She liked to do her jogging first thing in the morning, so it was not the first time they had intersected in this way. 6 treadmills had been mounted to the walls of this cylindrical module, the users' feet pointed outward, and their heads projected in toward the center, like spokes converging on a hub, bringing them rather close together and making conversation easy. For extroverted social people like Doob and Louisa, this was a great setup. More solitary exercisers would don headphones and pointedly focus on a tablet or a book. "Did you go to Venezuela when you were out collecting Archies?" Louisa asked him. The way she stressed the word go suggested that Venezuela was an obvious topic of conversation. The thing that well-informed persons would naturally begin talking about first thing in the morning. Doob didn't know why. He had heard a few people talking recently about Kourou, which was the place in French Guiana where the Europeans, and sometimes the Russians, launched big rockets into orbit. In the last 2 years, it had become one of the most important launch sites for arklets and supply ships. So he had the vague sense that something was afoot there, something that people were concerned about. He had been focusing all of his attention in the other direction, on Peach Pit and its iron-rich children. These were still visible through increasingly thick clouds of rocky debris. When the white sky happened, they would vanish into a cloud of dirt, and he might not see them for a while. So he had been looking at PP1, PP2, and PP3 while the looking was still good, nailing down their exact orbital parameters, taking high-res photographs. PP3 was especially interesting. It was a congealed glob of mostly iron, similar in composition to Amalthea. It was some 50 kilometers in diameter, and it had a deep cleft on one side, comparable in size to the Grand Canyon, apparently formed by a collision that had rent its outer skin while it was partly congealed. Doob had begun calling PP3 cleft. "Doob, you still with me?" Louisa asked. "I was going to say Earth to Doob, but it doesn't apply anymore."
"Sorry,"
he said. He had gone into a reverie thinking about the huge crevice on the side of cleft, imagining what it must look like from the inside.
What was your question again?
Venezuela, she said. Did you do any of your abduction runs there?
No, he said. Closest I came was Uruguay, which isn't that close. And by that time I was pretty burned out.
Why were you burned out? Typical Louisa. Overscheduling? She went on. That is, was it physical burnout, or more emotional, spiritual?
I had just had it,
he said.
It's hard. Taking young people, the best and the brightest, away from their families.
But it was for a good purpose, right?
Louisa, where are you going with this?
Are you aware of what is going on offshore of Kourou? She asked in return.
No,
he said flatly. You've checked out, she said.
I talk to my family every day. But other than that, yes, Louisa, I have checked out of planet Earth. Nice place, lovely people, but I have to focus on what comes next.
So say we all, she said, but one could argue that things happening in old Earth's final 3 weeks could have repercussions on new Earth.
What's going on?
He asked. Apparently, not a single one of the 75 Venezuelans who were picked in the casting of lots has actually been sent into space, she said.
You know that the overall ratio has ended up being something like 1 in 20,
Doob said, meaning that for every 20 candidates chosen in the worldwide casting of lots and brought to the training centers, only one had found a place up here in the Cloud Arc. Not a figure to be proud of, but it was the best they'd been able to do, and they hoped to bring the number down to more like 1 in 15, or even 1 in 10, with a last-minute surge of launches. Yes, and the Venezuelans know that too. So they're saying that 3 or 4 of their 75 ought to have made it up here by now.
Statistically, that is not a valid...
These people do not look like statisticians.
Politics.
Doob sighed. Louisa chuckled. I hear you, sugar. I'm not going to say you're wrong, but I have to warn you that this is the word, politics, that nerds use whenever they feel impatient about the human realities of an organization.
And I've been in enough faculty meetings at Caltech to know how right you are, Doob said, but I meant it in a different way. The way that the Venezuelans ran their selection program was overtly political. In most countries, they took the casting of lots idea with a grain of salt. There was a random element, yes, but they also filtered for ability. The Venezuelans chose not to do that. So they ended up sending in kids from the boondocks, truly chosen at random, many of whom had fine personal qualities. If I had my way, we'd get some of them up here. But I'm not the one who is choosing. The people who are choosing on the basis of math ability and things like that. So it makes me sad that other people are in line ahead of the Venezuelans. But it doesn't surprise me.
3 weeks ago, boat people started squatting on Devil's Island, Louisa said, refusing to move.
Isn't that a penal colony?
Doob asked.
Why would anyone?
It used to be a French prison, yes, Louisa said. Hasn't been for a long time. Hardly anyone lives there. But it's right under the flight path for launches out of Kourou, so whenever there's a launch, they evacuate it.
It must be evacuated all the time, then, given the amount of traffic.
For the last 2 years, yes. But then a bunch of people showed up there and camped out and refused to move.
I'm guessing that the French and the Russians went right on launching.
In fact, Doob knew as much, since he saw arklets and supply ships coming up from Kourou all the time. Yes, so the occupation was more of a symbolic gesture at that point.
These squatters were Venezuelans, I take it.
Yes. It is a fairly easy cruise along the coast from Venezuela to French Guiana, a few 100 kilometers. Something was itching in Doob's memory.
Does this have anything to do with the supply vessel that failed to show up yesterday?
And the day before. There's been a 2-day interruption, going on 3, in launches out of Kourou.
A few squatters on Devil's Island can't explain that,
Doob said. Then he added as a joke,
unless they have surface-to-air missiles.
Louisa said nothing.
Are you shitting me?
Doob said. It's not so much the ones on Devil's Island as the ones in the blockade, Louisa said. She handed her tablet to Doob. She'd pulled up what looked like an aerial photograph, probably shot out the window of a helicopter. In the foreground was the European Space Agency launch complex, which he'd seen before. It was separated from the Atlantic by a couple of kilometers of flat ground, banded with low, scrubby beach vegetation. In the distance was a trio of small islands, a few miles off the coast. He assumed that Devil's Island was one of them. The waters between the beach and the islands were choked with vessels, mostly small, but a few rusty freighters as well, a full-sized oil tanker that looked the worse for wear, and some ships that he could have sworn were military.
When was this taken?
Doob asked. A few hours ago, Louisa said.
Are those naval vessels?
The Venezuelan Navy is coming out to maintain order, Louisa said.
And you weren't kidding about the surface-to-air missiles.
The pirates who showed up in that oil tanker claimed that they had stingers, and that they would use them against the next rocket that lifted off from Kourou.
That is nuts,
Doob said. Politics, Louisa said. But we always knew it was going to happen, right? Good morning, doctors, said a new voice, that of Ivy Shao, entering the module to begin her own morning exercise routine.
Good morning, Doctor,
said Louisa and Doob in unison, though for Doob it was afternoon. Did I hear the P word? Yes, Louisa said. We were just talking about you, honey. Doob was appalled, but Ivy laughed delightedly. Ivy had been replaced, something like 8 months ago, by Marcus Luker, the Swiss fighter pilot, mountain climber, and astronaut. Or, to put it more precisely, a new position had been created that made Ivy's post redundant. Izzy was no longer just Izzy. It was the combination of the Cloud Ark fleet plus the vastly enlarged complex that Izzy had turned into. As such, a new leadership structure was required. The person at the top of that structure would shortly become the most powerful leader in human history, in the sense that 100% of all people alive would be under his or her authority. It was an altogether different job from being the first among the 12 equals who had been manning the International Space Station of 2 years ago. Nevertheless, Ivy could have done it. Everyone who really knew her agreed on that much. They had replaced her anyway. It was partly a matter of global politics. Placing overall command of the Cloud Ark under a representative of the United States, Russia, or China would have been seen as provocation by the two countries that had lost. So it had to be someone from a small country, preferably one that was seen as politically independent. This narrowed the list of candidates down to basically one: Marcus Luker. The dark horse being Ulrika Eck, the Swedish architect and project manager who had been launched up to Izzy at the same time as Marcus, but on a different vehicle in case one of them crashed. No one had ever really expected Ulrika to get picked, however. The choice was explained in terms of Marcus's dynamic leadership style, his charisma, and other such buzzwords that, as everyone understood, boiled down to the fact that he was a man. Ivy had failed, in the eyes of the Russians and of many in the NASA hierarchy, by not taking a firmer hand with Sean Probst. That wasn't the only complaint they had about her, but it was the one around which everything else had crystallized. Once everyone had begun to see her as the overly book-smart, well-meaning but weak-kneed technocrat, everything she did had been viewed through that lens. Dinah's rescue of Tekla had been examined under what doctors called the retrospectoscope, and been deemed a failure on Ivy's part to enforce necessary discipline. New arrivals to the Cloud Ark, prepped by internet comment threads and television pundits to see Ivy as a weak leader, began finding ways to make that into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The success of the Bolo 1 test, which in other circumstances might have bolstered her, came to be viewed as an almost literal handoff of authority from Ivy to Marcus. Presented with some choice opportunities to say supportive things about Ivy, Ulrika had declined to do so, and it wasn't clear whether that was mere absent-mindedness or an attempt to cement her position as number 2. In any case, it was all squarely in the realm of politics. Doob had avoided bringing it up around Ivy, not wanting to raise an awkward topic, and so he found it horrifying when Louisa went straight to it, and fascinating when Ivy laughed. People. "What is on your docket for today?" Louisa asked.
"Looking at spreadsheets," Ivy said, "trying to figure out the consequences of losing Kuru." "That is one monkey wrench we didn't need,"
Doob said.
"To be sure," Ivy said, "but in a weird way I'm almost—"
And she trailed off. "Glad? Relieved?" Louisa guessed.
"It's like the starting gun finally went off," Ivy said. "We've been prepping for this for almost 2 years, awaiting the disaster, waiting for all hell to break loose. And now it has, just not in the way we expected."
"What were you expecting?" Louisa asked.
"That we'd get hit by a bolide and take a lot of casualties," Ivy said. "Instead, something unexpected happened, which is good training in a way."
"How's your sweetie?" Louisa asked. Doob shut off his treadmill and unbuckled the padded belt that connected him to the bungee cords. He was the only man in a room where 2 women were talking about one of their boyfriends. He knew his cue to make himself scarce.
"He went dark on me 2 days ago," Ivy said, "which means he's probably underwater."
"I'm sure he'll pop up for air soon," Louisa said. "Can he send email when the submarine is submerged? I know nothing about it."
"There are ways," Ivy said,
but by that time Doob was floating out of the module. He made his way aft, down the stack to H2, then clambered down a spoke into the rotating Taurus T2, which Rhys Aitken had been sent up to build. Gravity in it was 1/8 of Earth normal. Originally designed as a space hotel for tourists, it had never been quite up to the requirements placed on it by the Cloud Ark project, and so Rhys had been put in charge of building a larger one, concentric with T2, and inevitably called T3. Never one to rest on his laurels, he had invented a completely new system for building it. Unsurprisingly to Dinah, this had consisted of assembling a long loop of high-tech chain and setting it in motion around T2, then adding stuff onto it incrementally. It spun around the same hub at the same RPMs, but because it was bigger, its simulated gravity was a little stronger, about equal to that on the moon. It housed the closest thing the Cloud Ark had to a bridge, a segment of T3 about 10 meters long, used by Marcus as his headquarters. Attempts had been made to dignify it with names such as Command Center, but at the end of the day it was just an upgraded version of the Banana, a conference room with some television screens and power feeds for tablet computers. Izzy didn't have a helm. It didn't have controls as such. No big wheel to turn for steering it through space, no throttle, just a bewildering assortment of thrusters controlled through a web interface that could be pulled up on any tablet, provided you had the right password. So the control room, the bridge, the command center could be anywhere. People had ended up calling the room Marcus had chosen the tank. Adjoining it, on one side, was a smaller office that served as Marcus's sanctum sanctorum. Next to the tank, on the other side, was a larger room with a number of cubicles, bizarrely like a suburban office park, where people supporting Marcus could sit and work. It had been called the Cube Farm for about 10 minutes and was now simply called the Farm. Adjoining the farm on the other side was a maze of cramped rooms where one could obtain food or use the toilet. Doob had found that the farm was frequently the least crowded place on Izzy, just because it didn't occur to people to go there. The gravity was good for his bones, and the availability of coffee and toilets were obvious pluses. So he tended to swing by a couple of times a day, get a beverage, see what was happening, and if things were quiet, grab a vacant carrel and do some work. He got there at about .2. The walls of the farm and of the adjoining tank were lined with projection screens, known in NASA speak as situational awareness monitors. They acted as windows onto various parts of the cloud arc and its environs. One was showing the Earth below them, another the cloud of debris that had been the Moon, another the approach of a supply module from Cape Canaveral getting ready to dock, another the progress of a bolo coupling drill being conducted by some newly arrived Archies several kilometers aft. Some just displayed statistics and bar charts. The biggest, at the far end of the farm, was occupied mostly by a grainy video feed from some part of the Earth where it was dark. A label, superimposed at the bottom, identified it as Kourou, French Guiana. Once Jube had that information to work with, he could make out the general scene. A galaxy of lights from the thousands of boats that had joined the People's Justice blockade. And in the background, the much more orderly precincts of the spaceport, where an Ariane stood on one pad and a Soyuz on the other, ready to launch, but still unable to do so because of the threat of those stingers. The silhouette of a military chopper passed between the camera and the lights of the launch complex. This was a 24-hour news network. The crawl, running across the bottom of the screen, was being updated every few minutes by the current BFR, or bolide fragmentation rate, which had started out at 0 on A+0 and been climbing ever since then. This was the number that, when it caromed through the bend in its exponential curve, would signal the onset of the white sky. The networks had been tracking it obsessively. There was an app for it. A bar in Boston had begun offering end-of-the-world drink specials whenever the BFR broke through certain milestones, and the promotion had been copied widely. Above the crawl was a smaller video inset showing an empty lectern in the White House briefing room. Apparently, they were expecting some sort of announcement. Jube sat in one of the carrels, spent a few minutes checking email, and then tried to get back to his main task, which was to write a memo about the distribution of metal-rich moon fragments, how they might be reached and exploited, and why that should be interesting to the management of the cloud arc. It was only a few sentences in, however, when movement on the big situational awareness monitor caught his eye, and he looked up into the eyes of the President of the United States. She was staring into the camera, or rather the teleprompter screen in front of the camera, and delivering some sort of terse announcement. She looked pissed off. Pinned to her lapel was a loop of ribbon. All the important people had been wearing these for the last few weeks, and they had become popular among the hoi polloi as a gesture of solidarity with the mission of the cloud arc. Selecting the color scheme had consumed resources equivalent to the gross domestic product of a medium-sized country. They had settled on a thin red line down the center, symbolizing the bloodline of the human race, flanked by bands of white, symbolizing starlight, flanked by bands of green, symbolizing the ecosystem that would keep the Archies alive, flanked by bands of blue, symbolizing water, and finally edged by bands of black, symbolizing space. The discussion had been as lively as the results were complicated. Black symbolized death to Westerners, white symbolized it to Chinese, and so on. This design offended everybody. It had gotten loose on the internet as the official ribbon design, even though the commission charged with designing it had become hopelessly deadlocked and was still evaluating 12 different candidate designs submitted by schoolchildren from around the globe. Factories in Bangladesh had been repurposed to hurl this stuff out by the linear kilometer, and they had shown up in kiosks and souvenir shops from Times Square to Tiananmen Square. And the world's leaders had bowed to the verdict and begun wearing them. The president had attached hers using a lapel pin consisting of a simple disc of turquoise rimmed in platinum. The blue disc on the white field was meant to echo Crater Lake amid the snows of November. It was a visual emblem of the Crater Lake Accord, and the closest thing that the cloud arc had to a flag. The sound had been turned down, so Doob couldn't hear what JBF was saying, but he could guess it well enough. And a few seconds later, the highlights began to show up in the crawl at the bottom of the screen. The so-called People's Justice Blockade was no grassroots movement, but an operation planned and carried out by the Venezuelan government. It was a reprehensible political stunt that was actively interfering with the all-important building of the cloud arc. It was not true, as some had been whispering, and the Venezuelan president was now openly saying, that the white sky was a hoax. The blockade was not, as its sympathizers would have you believe, a peaceful civil disobedience protest. Armed intruders had begun landing on the beaches of French Guiana a few hours ago and were now being held at bay by the French Foreign Legion, bolstered by a multinational force including United States and Russian Marines. Doob, doing his best to tune it out, couldn't defeat the irrational feeling that JBF was staring directly at him, a feeling he had come up here partly to get away from. One of the PR flacks down in Houston reached him over a video chat link that Doob had not had the presence of mind to disable. He talked Doob into spending the next hour writing a little homily about how everyone down on Earth needed to unite behind the all-important mission of the Cloud Arc, and detailing how the Kourou blockade was affecting that. Doob wanted, in the worst way, to tell this guy to get lost, but he had a soft spot for people who only had 3 weeks to live. Doob called Ivy, for Izzy had its own cell phone system now, and got her to supply a few hard quotable numbers, which he rounded off and typed into his script. He then devoted a minute to psyching himself up to adopt the Doc Dubois persona. Formerly the ruin of his first marriage, the basis of his livelihood, and his ticket to the Cloud Arc, Doc Dubois was a person he rarely had to be anymore. That guy seemed as dated as a character from a 1970s television serial. Getting into the persona was nearly as cumbersome as donning a spacesuit. It required an extra cup of coffee with sugar. When he felt he was ready, he turned on his tablet's video camera, identified himself as Doc Dubois, greeted the people of Earth, and read his little script. When he was finished, he emailed the file down to Houston. Then he tried to go back to his memo, but he became distracted when the situational awareness monitor flashed up a red "Breaking News" banner and began to show footage of indistinct flashes against a dark background. Some sort of hostilities had broken out on the ground in French Guiana, between the perimeter of the spaceport and the beach. The French Foreign Legion was participating in what might be the last battle ever fought. But the television news cameras couldn't get anywhere near the action, so the coverage mostly consisted of journalists interviewing each other about how little they knew. In the middle of all that, the flak in Houston got back to him and asked if he could please relocate to a part of Izzy where zero gravity prevailed, and re-record the little pep talk. Conspiracy theorists were saying that the Cloud Arc didn't really exist, and that it was actually just a bunch of movie sets in the Nevada desert. Whenever they saw video from parts of the space station with simulated gravity, they cited it as evidence, and added millions of friends and followers to their social media profiles. Doob said he'd see what he could do, and departed from the farm. Nothing was going on here anyway. Marcus wasn't around at the moment. He ascended a spoke to H2 and thus entered zero gravity. H2 had been the aftmost piece of the stack, the train of modules that ran up Izzy's central axis, until several weeks ago when the caboose had been launched up from Kourou and mated to its aft end. The main purpose of the caboose was to house a large rocket engine, burning hydrogen and oxygen, which would do most of the work of boosting Izzy's orbit. It wasn't possible to extend Izzy any farther back because, beyond that point, anything tacked onto it would no longer reside safely within Amalthea's protective envelope. And indeed, There had been long discussions of contingency plans for the case where the caboose took a hit and its engine was destroyed. Putting his back to the caboose, Doob began to drift forward up the stack. H2 led to H1, which led in turn to the old Zvezda module. This had formerly sported small photovoltaic panels to its port and starboard sides, but these, like most of Izzy's solar panels, had been folded up and removed to make space for other construction. During an intermediate stage of the architect's labors, power had come not from photovoltaics, but from little nukes, the same as those on the arklets. These still protruded from attachment points all over the space station, aglow with red LEDs meant as a warning to spacewalkers and pilots, and they still produced a significant amount of power and served as a valuable backup. But most of the station's power now came from a full-fledged nuclear reactor, adapted from those used on submarines, which was mounted on a long stick that projected to nadir from the caboose. There were a number of reasons why a big power plant might be needed, but the most important of these was to produce rocket propellant by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. And this explained why the reactor was where it was. The caboose housed the big boost engine that was Izzy's largest consumer of propellant. And it was also the central nexus of the shipyard complex, where smaller vehicles could be assembled from a kit of parts. Once assembled, they too would need propellant. Zvezda's forward terminus was a docking station with ports to the zenith and nadir sides, where scientific laboratories had been connected back before Zero. This tradition had been preserved, in a way, by turning that docking site into Grand Central Station for work related to the Cloud Ark's primary function of preserving the Earth's heritage. If Doob went up, in the zenith direction, he entered a long module whose main purpose was to support multiple docking ports where other vessels could be, and had been, attached. In general, these were crammed with priceless cultural relics, but some of them also supported server farms where digital recordings were stored. Certain relics were easier than others to send into space. The Magna Carta had made it up here, but Michelangelo's David was still on the ground. Considerable effort had gone into sealing up heavy relics in everything-proof vaults and leaving them on the bottom of the oceans or in deep mine shafts. But Doob had long since lost track of the progress of that undertaking. If instead Doob went down in the nadir direction, he entered a similar three-dimensional maze of modules. Most of these were devoted to storage of genetic material, seeds, sperm samples, eggs, and embryos. All of these needed to be kept cold, which in space wasn't too difficult. It was primarily a matter of shielding the storage containers from sunlight, which could be done with a featherweight piece of metallized mylar film, and secondarily a matter of just preventing the warmth of surrounding objects from seeping into the samples. Doob always paused when passing by that hatch. He was not a spiritual man, but he could not humanly ignore the fact that his potential fourth child, the embryo he and Amelia had created, was in there somewhere, along with tens of thousands of other fertilized embryos waiting to be thawed out and implanted in human wombs. He passed into Zarya, which was the next module forward in the stack. Having been mildly spooked by thinking about embryos, he now had a vague intention of going into the woo-woo pod to re-record his video. This was a spherical inflated structure, 10 meters in diameter, with several large domed windows. It was accessed from Zarya via a hamster tube on the nadir side, so it was aimed at the Earth. Ulrika Eck had drawn the ire of every religious group on the planet by refusing to provide separate places of worship for every single one of them in the Cloud Ark. Instead of sending up a church pod, a synagogue pod, a mosque pod, etc., she had provided this one structure, which was something like the interfaith chapel at an airport, in that all of the different religions had to share it. Internal projectors would display crosses, Stars of David or what have you, on its interior surfaces, depending on what sort of services were happening there at the moment. It had a long, cumbersome, politically correct name, but someone had dubbed it the Woo-Woo Pod, and the name had stuck. That someone paused for a few moments at the entrance to the hamster tube that led to it and detected the haunting tonalities of the Muslim call to prayer. Too bad. He'd thought that the pod might actually be a good backdrop for the message he was meant to deliver, but he would have to find another place. Directly across, a hatch led into the rambling group of modules that served as Izzy's sickbay. This had consumed much of the space formerly used by the port-side solar panels. At its farthest extremity, blocked off by an insulated hatch, was the surplus module that had been used as Izzy's morgue and graveyard since the first scout launch on A+0.29, when 2 of the cosmonauts had been found dead on arrival. The terrific mortality rate of those first few weeks had half filled this thing with freeze-dried bodies. Since then, 14 more had died of various causes. One, of a subarachnoid hemorrhage that could just as well have happened on the ground. 1 of a heart attack. 2 of suicide. 2 of equipment failure. 4, just a few days ago, in the sudden depressurization of an arklet struck by a bolide. Those, plus the dead stowaway, were all stored in the morgue. The whereabouts of the other 4 fatalities could only be guessed at. 1 was a spacewalker who had simply disappeared. The remaining 3 had been sleeping in a Xinjiao spacecraft docked to the end of a hamster tube, which had been struck by a bolide the size of a coffee table and essentially vaporized. Performing his video surrounded by free-floating, freeze-dried corpses would shut up the truthers, but otherwise had nothing to recommend it. On the opposite wing, where the starboard solar panels had once operated, was a roughly symmetrical arrangement of modules used by the general population for miscellaneous living and working purposes. These connected to the stack mostly by way of the old American modules, Unity, Destiny, and Harmony. Consequently, there tended to be a lot of humans flying around in those modules, getting from one part of the space station to another, or clustering for the equivalent of water cooler chats. Beyond Harmony was Node X. NASA liked to give these things names by organizing contests for schoolchildren, which was how Harmony had ended up being called that. But the Node X naming project had been defunded before achieving a result, so Node X it was. It had never really found a purpose, so it had become the place where the life sciences gear was stored, or rather, the central connector to which the life sciences modules had docked one by one as they had been sent up. This part of the stack was very close to Amalthea, and accordingly well protected, and so it was a good place to store that irreplaceable equipment during the wait for it to become useful. Doob poked his head into several of those modules, hoping to encounter Moira, then remembered that, London girl that she was on 3rd shift, not due to wake up for another 3 hours. It was about .5, pre-dawn in London. Beyond Node X was the considerably larger Scrum, which was literally bolted onto Amalthea at its forward end. So it was the forwardmost thing in the stack. Before Zero, it had been nearly deserted. Since then, it had grown and developed into the space-based headquarters of Arjuna expeditions. People called it the mining colony. They had plugged in more modules until all of its ports were occupied, and then they had begun to attach scaffolding and additional modules, rigid and inflatable, directly to the aft surface of Amalthea. It was around now that Doob forgot entirely about the task that the flak in Houston had assigned him, and decided to hang out here for a little while and see what was going on. By all rights, this ought to have been his favorite part of the Cloud Ark. Yet he never visited, because coming here put him in mind of politics, which stressed him out and distracted him. His earlier conversation with Louisa had brought home to him, however, that ignoring politics might not be the wisest long-term strategy. He might not care about politics, but politics cared about him. And besides, the people who actually worked here, people like Dinah, were terrific. He had no problem with them personally. He should spend more time with them. Right now, he was 3 hours short of the end of his waking cycle. This was the rough equivalent of mid-evening. Time to kick back and grab a beer. No better people to do that with than miners. The mining colony was political for 2 reasons. First of all, and most obviously, it had originated from a public-private partnership of which the private half was Arjuna Expeditions, Sean Probst's company, which had all been well and good until he had burst into H2, raised hackles, and ruffled feathers all over the place. Secondly, but much more murkily, there seemed to exist some fundamental disagreement about what the Cloud Ark was supposed to be and how it was expected to develop in the years following the white sky. Was it going to stay in place, i.e., remain in the same basic orbit? Transition to some other orbit? Would it stay together as a compact swarm or spread out? Or would it split up into 2 or more distinct swarms that would try different things? Arguments could be made for all of the above scenarios and many more, depending on what actually happened in the hard rain. Since the Earth had never before been bombarded by a vast barrage of lunar fragments, there was no way to predict what it was going to be like. Statistical models had been occupying much of Jube's time because they had a big influence on which scenarios might be most worth preparing for. To take a simplistic example, if the moon could be relied on to disassemble itself into pea-sized rocks, then the best strategy was to remain in place and not worry too much about maneuvering. It was hard to detect a pea-sized bolide until it was pretty close, by which time it was probably too late to take evasive action. A strike from a rock that size would perforate an arklet or a module of Izzy, but not destroy it. People might get hurt and stuff might get broken, but the worst case was that a whole module or arklet would be destroyed with the loss of a few lives. On the other hand, in the more likely scenario, where the hard rain included rocks the size of cars, houses, and mountains, detection from a distance would be easier. Evasive action would be not only feasible, but obligatory. Or at least, it was obligatory for Izzy. For a single arklet, it didn't matter whether it got struck by a rock the size of a baseball or one the size of a stadium. It was equally dead in either case. Izzy, on the other hand, could survive the first of these with the loss of a few modules, but the second would obliterate the whole space station and probably lead to the slow death of the entire Cloud Ark. Izzy had to be capable of maneuvering out of a large bolide's path. Maneuvering conjured images, in non-technical minds, of football players weaving among their opponents in an open field. What the architects had in mind was considerably more sedate. Izzy would never be agile. Even if she were, maneuvering in that sense would waste a lot of fuel. If an incoming rock big enough to destroy her were detected long enough in advance, she could get out of its path with a thruster burn so deft that most of her population would not even know it had happened. So, the optimistic view of how this was going to work was that Izzy would remain in something close to her current orbit, with occasional taps on the thrusters that would move her out of the way of any dangerous bolides hours or days in advance of the projected collision. The analogy was made to an ocean liner gliding through a field of icebergs, avoiding them with course changes so subtle that the passengers in the dining room wouldn't even see the wine shifting in their crystal stemware. There was, inevitably, a more pessimistic vision in which Izzy was more like an ox blundering across an 8-lane highway in heavy traffic. Depending on who was making the analogy, the ox might or might not be blindfolded and/or crippled. Which of these analogies was closer to the truth boiled down to a statistical argument in which were braided together assumptions about the range and distribution of bolide sizes, the amount of variation in their trajectories, how well the long-range radars worked, and how good the algorithms were at sorting out all the different bogeys and deciding which ones were dangerous. Somewhere in the middle, between the ocean liner and the blind ox, was the football player pushing the wheelbarrow. It didn't matter whether football for you was soccer or the American sport played by men in helmets. In either case, you were meant to envision a player trying to weave a path downfield among defenders. A skilled player could succeed at this when running unencumbered, but would fail if obliged to push a wheelbarrow with a boulder in it. The boulder, of course, was Amalthea, and the wheelbarrow was the asteroid mining complex that had been constructed around it. If this analogy were the one closest to the truth, then the wheelbarrow would have to be abandoned. The image was sufficiently clear and sufficiently alarming that some had begun to argue for ditching Amalthea as far back as day 30. More level-headed analysts pointed out that if the ocean liner analogy applied, there was no need to take such drastic action. And if Izzy were a blind, crippled ox on a freeway, there was no point anyway. Doob had his own bias, a bias frankly rooted in a certain frozen embryo, which was that the mining colony should be preserved at all costs. When he tried to filter out that bias and to look at the models and the data in a completely objective way, he concluded that the jury was still out. So technical discussions of the matter tended to be unproductive, except insofar as they revealed the biases that the participants had brought into the room with them. And here was where it started to get difficult for him personally, because he couldn't understand why anyone would harbor a bias different from his own. Why would anyone not want to keep the mining colony? What were they thinking? How could the Cloud Ark and the human race have a future without those tools and capabilities? In any case, the controversy had ramifications that extended into many seemingly mundane aspects of the Cloud Ark program. If Izzy was going to maneuver with Amalthea attached to it, then the structure holding the rock to the space station needed to be strong. To put it another way, the stronger it was, the more heroic maneuvers could be achieved without breaking it. The ability to perform such maneuvers made the survival of Izzy more likely, and so requests for additional structural work had a kind of self-justifying force. Conversely, a weaker structure limited maneuvering ability and increased the odds that they would have to jettison the mining colony in order to survive. And why dump scarce resources into beefing up a subassembly that was going to be abandoned anyway? A similar dynamic obtained in the case of propellant. More of it was needed to maneuver an Izzy with a big rock on it, which meant less of it for the arklets, limiting their autonomy and operating range. Thus, physics drove politics to the extremes of ditch the rock now or keep the rock at all costs. The mining colony now comprised 8 modules, plus an inflatable dome that was attached directly to the asteroid. The robots had spent several weeks welding a 3-meter diameter ring onto a circular groove that they had prepared on Amalthea's surface. The inflatable had been mated to it about 100 days ago and filled with breathable atmosphere. It was not quite a shirt-sleeves environment, since the asteroid was cold and chilled the air in the dome, and many of the robot's normal operations produced gases that were toxic, or at least irritating. But that wasn't the point of having a dome. The point was to recapture and reuse the gases used by the robot's plasma torches, making it possible to excavate and reshape the asteroid much faster than had been possible in the early days, when all of those gases had leaked away into space. Since then, Dinah's complement of robots had been heavily reinforced by newer and better versions of the same basic models that had been shipped up from Earth. And Dinah herself was now managing a crew of 12, working in shifts around the clock. They'd been expanding the tunnel she had carved into the asteroid long ago to protect her circuit boards from cosmic rays, making slow progress on hollowing out the asteroid, carrying bits of metal away to a bigger and better smelter that was turning them into steel. Since there was no real place for it in Izzy's master plan, They'd been putting that steel to work in reinforcing Amalthea's structural connection to Izzy, feeding back into the political argument again. Doob glided through a few of the mining colony's modules, asking people where Dinah was, and got non-committal answers. When he made a move in the direction of her shop, he sensed an uptick in nervous tension and did not understand why until Marcus Luker emerged, greeted him personally, and engaged him in friendly, inconsequential chit-chat. Stalling for time, as Doob understood, so that Dinah could have a few minutes to herself. It had been known for several months that Dinah had been having sex with Marcus, an activity referred to on Izzy as climbing the Daubenhorn. 2 other women were known to have attained that summit not long after Marcus's arrival, but since then Dinah had had him all to herself. By the standards of earthbound organizations, be they corporate or military, it was an eyebrow-raising violation of ethical standards for the boss to be sleeping with a subordinate. But a month from now, every living human would technically be one of Marcus's subordinates, so he either had to break the rules or be celibate for the rest of his life. No one who knew him very well saw the latter as a realistic option, unless he were to have his testicles surgically removed, a procedure that certain people on Izzy were longing to see performed. That being the case, there was a certain logic in his having settled quite early on Dinah. It might be unethical, but at least everyone knew where matters stood. Dinah was no one's idea of a pushover. No sane person could be worried that she was in any way feeling pressured or harassed. And, on the other side of that coin, people seemed to feel more comfortable knowing that Dinah was not on the prowl. By the mundane standards of Izzy gossip, her dalliance with Rhys Aitken had been sensational. Their eventual breakup, a big story, detailed in London tabloids. After that, she'd been unable to have coffee with any male crew member without stirring up more whispers. Being unequivocally in the bag with Marcus was a lot simpler. And yet it still had to be treated as if it weren't happening, which was why Marcus and Doob had to take part in this charade.
I don't know if you heard,
Doob told him,
but fighting has broken out on the ground, between the spaceport and the beach.
It was clear that Marcus hadn't heard, which was hardly surprising given that A, it wasn't his problem, and B, he'd been occupied. He was, understandably, quite relaxed at the moment, and it took a while for him to bring his formidable powers of concentration to bear on the matter at hand.
"I can't believe they will let it go on like that,"
he said.
The president made a statement. She looked like she was eating bolts.
"A government run by doomed persons is nothing to trifle with," Marcus said, "but I suppose the same could be said of the Venezuelans." He sighed. "I wonder if we should just accommodate some Venezuelan archies. There must be a few bright sparks."
That would have worked a couple days ago,
Doob said.
But now it's turned into one of those we don't negotiate with terrorists things.
A trace of a dry smile came over Marcus's lips. He had washed his face with the towelettes they all used. Doob could smell the industrial fragrance with which they were permeated.
"Of course," he said, "it wouldn't do to set a precedent that might be abused during the next 3 weeks.
The joke, such as it was, would have been completely unacceptable when uttered in public, or even in a meeting, so this was a way of saying to Doob, "You are in my confidence." Doob wasn't a leader, but he was fascinated by people who were, and how they went about their work.
Ivy's figuring out the ramifications of not having those arklets, those supplies.
"Thank God for Ivy,"
Marcus said. Since winning command of the Cloud Ark, he had never lost an opportunity to praise her, another skill that Doob reckoned must be inculcated into leaders in whatever mysterious leader academy churned them out. More likely it was an instinct.
"Well, my day begins," Marcus continued. "Thank you for the briefing."
Marcus, like a lot of the Europeans, ran on third shift, which meant that he was, in fact, beginning his day a couple of hours early.
Mine is winding down,
Doob said.
I thought I would get drunk with some miners.
No better people for it, Marcus said with a wink. I believe Dinah will be out in a minute. I think she would enjoy seeing you.
With that, Marcus pulled his phone from the pocket of his coverall and turned his attention to its screen while using the other hand to pull himself out of this module and down the stack. Doob was left floating in the middle of the scrum. The only thing between him and Dinah was a privacy curtain. He was about to say, "Knock, knock," when he heard a string of beeps emerge from a speaker on the other side. An incoming Morse code transmission, which he had not the skill to understand. To that point, Dinah had been quiescent, but he now heard her going into movement, peeling herself out of her sleeping bag. He thought better of bothering her just now, and decided to check his own email. She ran on first shift, which meant that this was mid-afternoon for her, traditionally a time when she began to feel a little drowsy, even when Marcus had not just been helping her relax. She felt that going fully to sleep would be a bad idea, partly because she had work to do, and partly because it would lead to more gossip than was happening already. She could hear Marcus chit-chatting with Dubois Harris on the other side of the curtain. She knew that he was stalling for her, giving her some time to pull herself together. She was duly appreciative, and she made the most of it, gliding in the liminal zone between dozing and waking until her radio began to beep. She knew immediately that this was not Rufus. She could tell as much by the fist of the transmission. It was faint, and it was clearly not the work of an experienced ham. Her eyes opened as a thought came to her. Maybe this was the source known as the space troll. That term had originated with Rufus, who had first mentioned it several days ago. "Have you heard from the space troll yet?" It was his name for a transmitter that he had begun picking up recently, and it matched what Dinah was hearing now. She ejected herself from the bag, turned up the volume on the receiver, and listened while pulling on a t-shirt and some drawstring pants. The signal sounded as if it was coming in from a homebrew transmitter. The owner had a sketchy understanding of the practices and etiquette of the CW, Morse code using, radio world. His dots and dashes were perfectly formed and came rapidly, as much as proving that he was using a computer keyboard and an app that automatically converted keystrokes into Morse. He was sending out a lot of QRKs and QRNs, which were queries about the strength of his own signal and the degree to which it was being interfered with. So he seemed a little insecure about the quality of his equipment. According to Rufus, as soon as you started transmitting back to the space troll, he would shoot back a spate of QRSs, meaning, "Please transmit more slowly." Further proof that he was a novice using a computer keyboard to form the groups, but not very good at deciphering what came back. He transmitted on one frequency only, which was the one that Rufus had, until a year ago, generally used to contact Dinah. This had become known to the Internet in the wake of a human interest story about the Macquarie family, and so for a few weeks it had been damned near unusable as every CW ham on the planet had tried to use it to contact Dinah. Then the word had gotten around that the Macquaries père et fille weren't using it anymore, and it had gone pretty silent, except for a few people who apparently hadn't gotten the memo, such as the space troll. Anyway, Rufus had gone back to monitoring that frequency again, and Dinah was now doing likewise. She had not personally heard any transmissions from the space troll. This was not remarkable. Her antenna was nothing compared to the one that Rufus had installed above his mine, and her receiver was something out of a fifth-grade science project. Except when Izzy was passing over his meridian, she and Rufus would naturally hear different stations. According to Rufus, having a conversation with the space troll required patience or a sense of humor. The fact that novice hams were screwing around on the radio, which would have driven Rufus into a spasm of righteous fury a few years ago, now just seemed like a sign of the times. Of course, people were getting interested in amateur radio. The internet was expected to go down as soon as the hard rain started. And of course, many of them were novices. When they finally did begin an intelligible conversation, Rufus would send QTH, which meant, "Where are you?" and would get back QET. This was an unofficial Q code, a sort of corny joke meaning "not on planet Earth." And that was why Rufus called this guy the space troll, because, among other oddities, he didn't have a call sign, or at least didn't use one. The signal she was hearing now was QRA, QET, repeated every few seconds. It meant basically, "Hello, this is ET. Is anyone listening?" Dinah generally kept the transmit side of her rig turned off when not in use. She turned it on now, but kept her hand well clear of the brass telegraph key. Lurking and listening were harmless, but as soon as she touched that thing, the space troll would hear an answering beep, and then she might never be rid of him. More likely, though, was that the space troll would give up after a while. Then she could transmit to Rufus, who'd be coming up over the horizon in a few minutes, and let him know that she, too, had heard from the mysterious extraterrestrial. It would be good for a laugh, and a few minutes' distraction. Her father sounded like he could use some of both. It had long since become obvious that he and a number of his mining industry friends had mounted a serious operation to prepare for an extended stay beneath the surface of the Earth. They were hardly the only ones to think that way. People were digging holes in the ground all over the world. Most of them would be dead within hours or days of the beginning of the hard rain. Constructing an underground complex that could sustain itself for thousands of years was an operation of which few, if any, organizations were capable. Most of those were governmental or military. But if any private group could do it, it was Rufus and his network. The sorts of questions he had been asking her for the last 2 years left nothing to the imagination. To the extent that the experts on Izzy knew anything about long-term sustainability of artificial ecosystems, Rufus now knew it too. Distracted by thinking about Rufus and his mine, Dinah became aware that the space troll's transmission had changed. Instead of the familiar QRA-QET, it now began with QSO, which in this context meant, "Can you communicate with?" This was followed by an unfamiliar call sign, which she didn't recognize as such because it was so long. A string of digits and letters that didn't follow any of the standard conventions for radio call signs. The third time this transmission was repeated, she wrote it down, 12 characters in all, a basically random assortment of digits and letters. But she did notice that all the letters were in the range A through F, which was a strong hint that this was a number expressed in hexadecimal notation, a system typically used by computer programmers. The fact that it had 12 digits was also a clue. The network chips used by almost all computer systems had unique addresses in that format, 12 hexadecimal digits. And here was where Dinah got a weird feeling on the back of her neck, because the first few digits in that string looked familiar to her. Network interface chips were produced in large batches, with unique addresses assigned to each chip in sequence. So, just as all Fords rolling off the assembly line in a given week might have serial numbers beginning with the same few characters, all the network chips in a given batch would start with the same few hex digits. Some of Dinah's chips were cheap, off-the-shelf hardware made for terrestrial use, but she also had some rad hard ones, which she hoarded in a shielded box in a drawer beneath her workstation. She opened that drawer, pulled out that box, and took out a little green PC board, about the size of a stick of gum, with an assortment of chips mounted to it. Printed in white capital letters directly on the board was its MAC address, and its first half-dozen digits matched those in the transmission coming from the space troll. She reached for the key encoded in QSO, meaning, in this context, "Yes, I can communicate with," and then keyed in the full MAC address of the little board in her hand, different from the one in the original transmission. It was a way of saying, no, I can't communicate with the one you mentioned, but I can communicate with this other one. QSB, came the answer back. Your signals are fading. Then QTX-46, which she guessed meant something like, will you be available on this frequency 46 minutes from now? As anyone on Izzy would understand, this meant, I will call you back when you have orbited around to the other side of the planet. QTX-46, she answered back. Yes. They were passing over the terminator, currently dividing the Pacific into a day side and a night side. Who the hell are you talking to? This was a transmission from Rufus, loud and clear. She looked out the window to see the west coast of North America creeping over the horizon toward them, identifiable as a pattern of lights delineating the conurbations of the Fraser Delta, Puget Sound, the Columbia River, San Francisco Bay, which meant that Alaska had line of sight to Izzy.
Knock, knock,
came the voice of Dubois Harris through the curtain. He'd been waiting there for a long time. Come in, Dinah said, and keyed back a brief transmission to Rufus, making a joke about the space troll and telling him she would be in touch later. She checked the world clock app on her computer screen. It was shortly before .7, therefore 7 a.m. in London, therefore 10 in the evening for Rufus in Alaska.